Chapter 363. It was said to be an auspicious day on the 22nd day of the 3rd month in the 6th year of the Qing calendar. Thus, after the imperial envoy arrived in Jiangnan, the palace treasury's first New Year opening bid was chosen for this day. The spring sunshine was bright and beautiful, and the gentle breeze brought warmth. The young masters and ladies in Suzhou all headed out for a walk. The grass on the wide road had not yet grown, and the birds had not yet flown, but they were already startled. Outside the city, there were green mountains everywhere and threads of green water, making it a good place for men and women to hook up. The air was filled with a fresh and beautiful smell. Suzhou was another scene. South of the Jiangnan governor's manor was the Palace Treasury Transport Company's permanent Suzhou Yamen. Regardless of whether it was the Yamen of the various departments of Jiangnan Road or the Yamen of the Suzhou government, they were all opened in this area. It was a place where the atmosphere of officials gathered. Usually, it was heavily guarded and the most important place to guard. Today, one could only see soldiers patrolling the two sides of the street, each holding a long spear in their hand. There were also bailiffs who forced themselves to be alert and vigilantly watched the movements of all sides in the thick spring sleepiness. This large area had already been tightly controlled. Every year on the opening day of the palace treasury, it was always like this. First, it was because the large merchants from all over brought too much silver. Second, it was because other than the officials of the transport company, there were also eunuchs sent by the palace to supervise the opening of the palace treasury. The governor of Jiangnan Road would also be present to listen. At this time, the group of imperial censorate censors who had nothing to do all day could not be missing. There was too much silver gathered here today and too many high-ranking officials, so the issue of safety became the most important. Fortunately, Suzhou was deep by the banks of the Yangtze River. The Qing kingdom's military was powerful, so no power dared to make any probing moves. Even the thieves in Suzhou had long been chased out of the city. It was a good time to collect money during the Qingming festival. As usual, the transport company had vacated a large courtyard. This courtyard was incomparably wide. Along the two sides of the main hall were a row of small rooms. It was said to have been the examination venue for students in the Jiangnan area in the previous dynasty. Later, when the Qing emperor inspected the palace treasury in the south, he found that this kind of layout was suitable for holding bids. Thus, he set it here and formed the usual practice. Usually, this courtyard was empty in the highest area of Suzhou. It was loaned by the transport company to the governor's manor yamen to manage accounts. However, it was returned to the transport company yamen in March. It had been renovated and cleaned since more than 10 days ago. Now, the house was extremely bright and clean. There were soldiers standing guard outside the house, and a few plain-looking guards stood by the side of the hall in the courtyard. The light in the hall was a little dim, and one could only vaguely see a row of 4 armchairs placed behind a table. When the Suzhou branch of the capital Xinfeng restaurant on South Street ran out of jietang buns, the door to this house finally opened. The merchants from various states did not panic. They ascended the stairs in an orderly manner, turning a blind eye to the vigilant gazes of the soldiers around them. After more than 10 years, they had long understood this whole set of procedures. Behind a merchant was often a family, as well as the political factions behind the family. The opening of the palace treasury was a matter of great importance, so the representatives who came today were all prominent figures in their families. However, there were not many of them. These merchants all brought their own attendants and accountants behind them. They also carried boxes, account books, and other related tools. Walking in front of everyone was, of course, the representative of the Ming family. Since last year, the Ming family had already handed most of their power to young Master Ming Lansher's hands. The old Ming master rarely showed his face in public. What shocked many of the merchants was that the old Ming master, Ming Qingda, had personally come to the large courtyard. Ming Qingda narrowed his tired eyes and raised his hands in greeting to his colleagues. He stroked the long beard on his chin and walked proudly through the door. The Jiangnan merchants faintly saw the Ming family as their leader. They quickly returned the greeting and followed behind him through the door. No one felt a glimmer of unease. Since it was the palace treasury bidding, of course, the Ming family would go first. Everyone did not understand why the Ming family would be so cautious today and even invite the old master. Occasionally, someone would think of the new head of the transport company in the palace treasury, the imperial envoy. They would also think of the young master of the Ming family communicating endlessly in secret this month. Only then did they faintly guess that today's palace treasury bidding would probably not be as smooth as in previous years, nor would it be as bright and joyous as today's spring scenery. The 2 rows of rooms under the eaves had long been pasted with names. The families entered one by one. The Ming family was in the first large room on the left. They had brought the most people, a full 16 shopkeepers and waiters. Once they entered the room, there were servants arranged by the transport company to pour them tea, hand over warm towels, and some exquisite pastries. Although it was the government that had opened the bidding, they knew that these rich people had to be well received. Using the words Fan Xian had said with a smile after learning of the previous arrangements, if they were going to kill a pig, they had to fatten it up first. Ming Qingda sat steadily in his chair. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the light scattering through the courtyard outside. Before entering the courtyard, he had made eye contact with the merchants and knew that everyone's thoughts were the same. In the face of profit, no one was willing to raise the price, particularly those merchants. They did not dare to offend him. Thinking of this, Ming Qingda's heart relaxed slightly. He asked in a low voice, "How much longer?" Ming Launcher stood obediently by his father's side. He lowered his body and said, "Soon." He stretched out a pair of white hands and brought the tea in front of his father. His hands were so clean it was as if they had never been stained with blood. Ming Qingda nodded. Since the court was still inventing bids and no one in the world had the wealth to fight with him, there shouldn't be much difference from previous years. For some reason, his lips were still a bit dry. Perhaps it was because he was gradually getting older, and his energy was always lacking. Thinking of this, a strange emotion welled up in the master of the Ming family's heart. His mother was already so old, why was her body still so healthy? Ming Qingda unconsciously swept his gaze across and easily identified the families these rooms represented. Although he had rarely personally entered the market these years, his friendship with the older generation was still there. The families that had come today were all descendants of the second generation. Presumably, they knew that of the 16 palace treasury bids, the Cui family could fight for the ones the Ming family had vacated. As for the 8 that the Ming family had set in stone, they could not move. However, the door to the last room under the eaves was still closed. No one knew which family had sent in their bid, but the person had not arrived yet. Ming Qingda took a sip of tea and moistened his throat. He furrowed his brows and said, "Whose family is B6? It's about to start, why hasn't the person arrived yet?" Ming Launcher was startled and was unable to reply. He had clearly investigated in detail, so why was that room still empty? Some kind of warning sign began to grow in Ming Qingda's heart. After Fan Xian returned the 400,000 liang banknotes, he sank into silence. He didn't know what exactly the imperial envoy was thinking. He glanced at his son and said with slight anger, "When doing things, you have to be watertight. You haven't even checked the person clearly. What if something goes wrong later?" Ming Launcher's expression was slightly embarrassed. He could only admit his mistake, but he was not satisfied in his heart. These figures of wealthy families all had this bad habit of not saying what they thought. He probingly said, "Could it be a salt merchant? They have always done things strangely. Perhaps they are also envious this time." Ming Qingda's expression was dark. He shook his head and said, "It's not a salt merchant. First, they gave us a promise. Second, Sir Shui also once gave me a promise. This master of the Ming family looked at the empty room across from him. He looked at the tightly shut door and the faint coldness seeping through the glass window. A powerful unease welled up in his heart. It is truly a pity this time. In the study of the Jiangnan governor's manor, an advisor sighed. The Chui family has left 6 empty, yet it is not convenient for us to interfere. We can only watch as so much silver is divided up by the Ming family and those local rich landlords. It is truly a pity. The governor of Jiangnan Road, first-level official Sir Xueqing, wore a slight smile on his face and did not say anything. The advisor sitting beside him also showed a look of pity and said, "Yang Jimei came a few times a few days ago. He was still hoping that you could help him put in a good word for him in front of Sir Fan Jr. His family has been in the salt business for generations. Now, looking at the fat meat of the palace treasury, he is also hungry." Yang Jimei was the largest salt merchant in the 2 Huai rivers, or rather, a salt smuggler. He had always carefully curried favor with the governor's manor. Xueqing thought for a bit and then smiled. Hungry? Who isn't hungry? Yang Jimei, that old killing talent. I asked him for such a good Hua garden, but he stubbornly refused to give it to me. This time, he insists on going through my hands to give it to Fan Xian as a residence. Do you think I don't know what he is thinking? Does Sir Fan not know? As the Jiangnan governor, he controlled 1/7 of the world's military and civil affairs. His power was strong and powerful, and he had many eyes and ears. Thinking of something, he couldn't help but sigh. Sir Fan will certainly have to give Yang Jimei some face in the future, but the matter of the palace treasury, he won't have much of a chance. The advisor asked curiously, what exactly is the imperial envoy thinking? Who exactly is he planning to give the 6 empty spots to? The smile on Xueqing's face gradually faded. Actually, there is no need to ask. Since the emperor sent him to Jiangnan, these 6 spots will naturally be prepared by him. He then smiled coldly and said, "Never mind these 6 spots, I think it will be very difficult for the Ming family to keep their own 8 spots." The advisor furrowed his brows deeply and said, "I just don't know which family Sir Fan Jr. has chosen this time." Xueqing smiled mockingly. He ruled over Jiangnan, so he knew what Fan Xian had done. He smiled and said, "I'm afraid none of you would have thought of that choice. This imperial envoy is indeed very powerful. He did not choose a spokesperson from among the merchants and instead poached someone from the wilderness. If that guy had swaggered into Sucheng on a normal day, I would probably have thrown him into prison and demanded some benefits." The advisor did not know the inside story and laughed dryly. He was still a bit reluctant in his heart and probingly asked, "Concerning the matter of opening the palace treasury, did the imperial envoy not say anything to you?" According to the customs of officialdom, a fat piece of meat like the palace treasury could not be swallowed up by a single faction of officials, particularly since Xueqing's position was high and deeply rooted in Jiangnan. No matter how arrogant Fan Xian was, he still had to show some goodwill to the governor's manor. Xueqing furrowed his brows slightly and shook his head. Naturally, Sir Fan Jr. has mentioned this matter. Although he is young, he does things very smoothly. Minister Fan and Director Chen have taught him well. However, I had no choice this time and could only politely decline Sir Fan Jr.'s good intentions. The advisor cried out in surprise. Politely decline good intentions? As long as Fan Xian opened his mouth, this small good intentions would probably be worth at least a few 100,000 liang of silver. When did the governor become so incorruptible and self-restrained? Had he learned to change his face? Xueqing smiled self-mockingly and stood up. Although it is close, we should still leave first. Sir Fan Jr. is waiting in the courtyard, as is Guozheng, that white-faced old man. The eunuchs from the palace are also coming with an edict. We can't be too slow. He did not explain to the advisors who were even closer to him than his wife why he had politely declined Fan Xian's good intentions. Xue Qing knew that although the palace treasury appeared to be a contest between Fan Xian and the eldest princess, there was actually a deeper meaning behind it. Just how should the princes be ranked? This was already beginning to become a thorny problem. Xue Qing's identity did not allow him to pick a side too early. Otherwise, the emperor would be very angry. Thus, it was not convenient for him to partake in this feast of the palace treasury. Under the protection of the guards, he walked out of the front door of the Jiangnan governor's manor. Xue Qing unconsciously turned his head and looked at the signboard in front of the manor. His eyes were dazzled by the newly risen sun. A powerful sense of unease welled up in his heart. The emperor's actions these years had become increasingly strange. Everyone under heaven was looking at Jingdo and guessing at the future situation. For the Qing court, this kind of turmoil was definitely not a good thing. If people's hearts were uncertain, what would the officials do? Your Majesty, what exactly are you thinking? The palace treasury opened. The merchants who had come to bid were already sitting in their rooms waiting. Fan Xian, who was in charge of this matter, was still leisurely drinking tea. The person drinking tea and conversing with him was a eunuch from Jingdo. The palace treasury was the property of the royal family. According to the rules, it had to be jointly supervised by Taichung Temple and the internal court. Since Fan Xian himself was a junior official of Taichung Temple did not send anyone else to Suzhou for unnecessary matters. It also saved him a lot of trouble. However, a senior eunuch had come. At the same time, it was a big problem. Eunuch Huang speaks reasonably. Fan Xian placed the teacup on the table and smiled slightly. I also think that it is better to stay put than to move. Everything should be done according to the old rules. This senior eunuch from the palace had a very high rank. Otherwise, he would not have been entrusted with such a heavy responsibility. He had a fat head and big ears, and the fat on both sides of his cheeks were piled together. Hearing Fan Xian's words, he smiled insincerely and said, "With you in charge of this matter, I am at ease." This eunuch had always been deep in the inner palace. Although he knew of Fan Xian's great name, he thought that he had the emperor's orders and was not afraid of him. On the contrary, he had been in Suzhou for a few days, but Fan Xian had not invited him to his manor for a chat. This fact of being ignored made eunuch Huang feel uncomfortable in his heart. In the conversation earlier, eunuch Huang had brought Fan Xian a piece of very bad news. More accurately, he had passed on the Empress Dowager's verbal order for Fan Xian to manage the matter of the palace treasury. He had to follow the old rules and not mess around. Do not mess around? The old rules? Fan Xian smiled coldly in his heart. Naturally, this meant that what should belong to the Ming family should belong to the Ming family. The rest could be slowly dealt with by himself. It looked like after the eldest princess returned to the capital, the Empress Dowager's heart ached for this young daughter. She had pulled a long face and used so much face. He knew that the Empress Dowager was warning him not to go overboard in his actions. He had to leave some living money for the members of the royal family to spend. Thinking of this, Fan Xian couldn't help but want to laugh. He thought to himself that his emperor was known as the emperor of a generation. How come he was living more and more these years? How could he allow his mother and sister to send the family business to his son's manor? Of course, he knew that the emperor was not a simple person. However, he was becoming more and more confused as to why the emperor had created such a chaotic situation. If you want great governance, you must first create great chaos. He unconsciously furrowed his brows and said. What? Eunuch Huang asked curiously. Nothing, Fan Xian smiled and said. I have troubled you to pass on the edict. Eunuch Huang coughed and said with slight arrogance, it is because the Empress Dowager trusts a servant like me. Of course, I also have to thank Sir Fan Jr. for giving me this face. Fan Xian didn't reply. He only smiled and looked at Eunuch Huang's pig-like face. A moment later, he said, "Your face." Eunuch Huang was startled. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "Eunuch Huang, in front of me, it is best if you put away that act. Old Yao, Old Dai, and Old Ho know how to conduct themselves better than you." Eunuch Huang was furious but then immediately shocked. The three people Fan Xian mentioned were all powerful eunuchs in the palace. Although Old Dai had long lost power, other than the head eunuch Hongzhu who had recently been transferred to the Eastern Palace, Old Yao and Old Ho all had more face than him. Fan Xian saying this meant that even Eunuch Yao and Eunuch Ho had to be respectful in front of him. What did he think he was? Eunuch Huang was shrewd and restrained his anger. On the contrary, he smiled and replied, "Sir is right." In his heart, he looked down on Fan Xian. Such a young and powerful official who made enemies everywhere would probably not last long in the future. Furthermore, he was, after all, close to the Empress Dowager. His identity was a bit special. Fan Xian gave a not quite there smile and said, "Eunuch Huang, in Suzhou, it is best if you behave yourself." Eunuch Huang lowered his face and replied, "Imperial envoy, what are you saying?" "You speak in Jingdo," Fan Xian said darkly. "What I hate the most is when someone uses the Empress Dowager to pressure me. Other people are somewhat afraid of you, but that does not include me. After you return to the capital, you can go around talking about it and see what kind of situation it will be." Eunuch Huang raised his head in anger. How dare an official be so disrespectful to the Empress Dowager? Did Fan Xian really not want his life anymore? Fan Xian had his reasons for saying this. With a cold expression, he swept out his sleeves and turned down a side corridor toward the main hall of the manor. Throwing down one last sentence, he said, "Understand your own identity. Your surname is not Hong." Other than Eunuch Hong, what else was there in that chilly royal palace that Fan Xian feared? Fan Xian stood coldly on the stone steps in front of the main hall. The merchants in the rooms under the eaves on both sides quickly came out and bowed to him. His gaze stared straight at the main door. He didn't even glance at the Ming father and son in the primus room closest to him. The large door was pushed open with a creak. A line of silent people slowly walked in. This group of people did not carry the usual aura of wealth and nobility of merchants, nor did they have the smell of officials. Instead, they were filled with a sense of bloodthirsty wilderness. When this group of people stood in the middle of the courtyard, it was like a few vicious wolves had suddenly appeared among a flock of sheep. There was a deer's tail on top of a cake. It appeared out of place and extremely abrupt. The person in the lead was the commander of the Jiangnan water bandits, Xia Qifei. Xia Qifei was wearing a light green washed silk, but it still could not hide the iron-blooded aura on his body. Although his expression was calm, his slightly narrowed eyes still revealed a glimmer of excitement and nervousness. Xia Qifei raised his hands in a salute toward Fan Xian and said, "Sir Envoy, I have come late." "Not late," Fan Xian said coldly. "As long as you came, it's fine." The big merchants in Jiangnan often had shady businesses. Furthermore, they also relied on the power of the local wilderness in many places. As the leader of the Jiangnan water bandits, Xia Qifei actually had some secret dealings with these merchants and even the Ming family. Therefore, there were some people who had seen Xia Qifei's true appearance. Today, when he led his subordinates to stand in the courtyard, there were people with sharp eyes who immediately recognized him. The whispers gradually rose and gradually turned into countless exclamations of surprise. Even water bandits had come to the palace treasury to bid. The large merchants looked at Xia Qifei in the courtyard with faces full of terror. They couldn't resist glancing at Fan Xian standing on the stone steps. No matter how they thought about it, they could not understand this matter. Water bandits doing business? Then what would they, the merchants, do? Were they going to be mountain bandits? This world, ever since Sir Fan Jr.'s name had appeared, it seemed to have become strange and motley, and difficult to grasp. What these Jiangnan merchants were more curious about was, even if Xia Qifei went around robbing, how could he gather so much silver? However, since these Jiangnan water bandits had already entered the door of the palace treasury, presumably they had at least paid the security deposit. If water bandits could make so much money, then why did they still need to work so hard to do business? Standing in the doorway of the room closest to the stone steps, Ming Qingda narrowed his eyes and looked at the last person to enter the courtyard. In a quiet voice, he said, "Who is this person?" "It should be Xia Qifei," Ming Launcher said next to his father's ear. "The leader of the Jiangnan water bandits. I've had some contact with him in the past, but I've never seen him in person. I don't know what's going on, but he's also here today to join in the fun." Ming Qingda's eyes narrowed even more. It was almost impossible to see the deep coldness in them. They only heard him faintly say, "Looks like, this person is a chess piece the imperial envoy planted in advance." At this moment, Xia Qifei slowly turned his head and met the gaze of the master of the Ming family. He smiled slightly. His smile was very sincere, revealing boundless enmity and bloodthirsty desire. With Fan Xian's help, the seventh young master of the Ming family, who had his mother killed and his property stolen, finally had the opportunity to stand upright on the stage for revenge. The chapter is called The Door of the Palace Treasury. This is the name I thought of when I wrote the first chapter of the year of Qingyu. I've finally written this chapter. It feels very good, ha ha ha. To be continued. If you want to know what happens after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 364. They didn't have to wait too long before the Jiangnan governor, Xueqing, also hurried over. Imperial censor Guozheng, who had been dawdling in the back courtyard, finally walked to the front hall. At this time, the officials from all four sides who were in charge of and supervising the opening of the palace treasury finally gathered together. Guozheng was no longer the imperial censor of the left, who was the prestigious imperial censor of the imperial censorate, but he still had a certain amount of power in inspecting the various roads. His and Fan Xian's old grievances had not been resolved, so it was difficult to avoid awkwardness when they met. As the four officials bowed to each other, they always felt that Fan Xian's calm and cold gaze hid a glimmer of danger. Of the four officials, Eunuch Huang, who had come from the capital, represented the palace. The Jiangnan governor, Xueqing, represented the court official system. The imperial censor, Guozheng, represented the imperial censor system. As for Fan Xian, he represented many powers, such as the Palace Treasury Transport Company, the Overwatch Council, and even Taichung Temple, the organization that managed the royal family. Of course, everyone represented the court and the emperor. Fan Xian sat in the second chair and smiled slightly as he spoke to Xueqing. He saw the situation clearly. There were too many people watching this matter. Regardless of who it was, regardless of which power, it would be difficult for them to complete the transactions under the table. The palace treasury bidding process formed in history effectively ensured fairness. At least, it was fair on the surface. As long as the merchants had money, they could fight for the right to sell the 16 items of the palace treasury. He thought this way, and the other three also thought this way. Eunuch Huang and Guozheng met each other's eyes. Although there was a hidden uneasiness, in their opinion, Fan Xian could not play any tricks in front of everyone. What they had to ensure was that the Ming family would still be able to obtain the same share as in previous years. Eunuch Huang and the imperial censor were originally two classes that were as incompatible as fire and water in history. Today, they stood in the same camp with great tacit understanding. However, These two did not understand many secrets and did not pay enough attention to the last person to enter the palace treasury door, Master Xia Qifei. Shui Qing was different. The Jiangnan governor had the attitude of watching a show. With a face full of peace, he watched the giant merchants and the people around him below the stage. Watching a show was not afraid of the height of the stage. It was always easier than acting. A number of people sang on one side of the stage. The thick doors of the palace treasury courtyard slowly closed again. The soldiers and Overwatch Council officials outside pulled up tight defenses. In the past, the palace treasury bidding usually ended in a day. However, the rules of the court allowed each merchant to use 2 days to bid. There was a loud bang. Fan Xian smiled and covered his ears, looking at the spring thunder rising into the sky outside the courtyard. The spring thunder soared into the sky, exploding under the light clouds. The sound was clear and crisp, spreading far and wide to the ground, causing countless people's hearts to tremble. In the city of Suzhou, the brothel girls who had worked hard last night were roused by this thunderclap. They cursed a few obscenities, then crawled back into their quilts and slept soundly. The child who was begging his parents for money to buy candies on the street thought that God was punishing him for being naughty. He was so scared that he started crying. In the backyard, the black dog that was peeing on an old tree root was startled by the thunder. It lowered its front limbs and buried its head in its furry bag, mimicking an ostrich. Humans' reactions were always different. When this spring thunder fell into the ears of some people, it had a different meaning. Regardless of whether it was the various advisors and shopkeepers gathered on the north pier of Suzhou or the Suzhou residents discussing the matter of the bidding in the tea houses, everyone raised their heads and looked in the direction of the south of the city. Looking at the invisible courtyard, they knew that the palace treasury bidding had already begun. The palace treasury bidding in the spring of the 6th year of the Qing calendar had actually not gone smoothly from the beginning. First, the Palace Treasury Transport Company summarized the profits and losses of each merchant last year. Naturally, there was no lack of words of encouragement. The deputy of the transport company, Ma Jie, who was responsible for giving the speech, sternly reported the situation of the court's investigation of the Chui family. This was a warning to the merchants below not to think that the court was not watching them. These were the rules of the past, so no one cared. However, when Ma Jie talked about the specifics of today's bidding, the mansion was in an uproar. The merchants all stood up to express their opposition. Even the 4 high officials sitting in the main hall began to argue. The transport company had suddenly decided to divide the original 16 items into 34 smaller items and would not carry out bundled bidding this year. This change did not appear to be big, but for the merchants below, it was something they could not accept. The reason was very simple. 3 months before the bidding, these Jiangnan merchants had already privately colluded with each other, drawing up the boundaries between each other. Well water does not interfere with river water, so as to avoid hurting each other's harmony, and even more so by raising the price and hurting their wealth. For example, what the Lingnan Xiong family had to fight for this year was the northern bid for the wine category, while the Quanzhou Sun family wanted the overseas marketing rights for their porcelain goods. If they followed the transport company's intentions and divided the 16 major items into 34 smaller items, although on the surface, everyone could still maintain their bottom line, the 8 major items that were expected to go to the Ming family would be divided into 2 bundled bids. After they were all broken down, who knew whether or not some merchant would suddenly become envious and want to steal some of the Ming family's share? After all, after they were no longer bundled, it seemed that the most profitable sources of income did not need that much silver. Once someone was tempted by the Ming family's share, what would happen to the Ming family? They would certainly go back and steal someone else's share. This was determined by the profit-seeking nature of merchants. They were only afraid that when the palace treasury opened its doors today, it would be a mess. These Jiangnan merchants, what they were most afraid of was chaos. The Ming family had already agreed that they would not interfere with the Cui family's share. These merchants could already eat a few more bowls of fat meat today. Of course, they didn't want anyone to mess up their plans. In their eyes, the reason why the imperial envoy would make such a change was actually very simple. First, he wanted everyone's eyes to turn red from killing in the chaos and raise the price. Second, he wanted to break down the income and dilute the amount of silver needed for each item. He wanted Xiaofan, who entered the courtyard last, to also get a share of the pie. These crafty merchants had already realized that the long silent room before was the imperial envoy's chosen representative. However, we can all understand that the imperial envoy wants to earn money, but you can't use such a seemingly fair but actually evil method. Sir Fan, this proposal is not appropriate. After Eunuch Huang's face had been shaved by Fan Xian, he still appeared sufficiently calm. He squeezed out a smiling expression on his fat face and said, according to the rules of the past, 16 items are 16 items. Why do we suddenly have to divide them? This matter has to be decided by the capital. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said a few words. He then turned his head and said to Xue Qing in a low voice, Governor, dividing them into smaller items and no longer binding them is actually just to allow more people to have the right to enter. This matter is always beneficial to the court. Xue Qing was silent for a moment and revealed a difficult expression. Although it is so, this matter is no small matter. I think Sir Fan should report it to the court, and after it has been discussed in the palace, we can slowly push it forward next year. Seeing that Xue Qing had also expressed his opposition, Fan Xian felt a bit unhappy. Looking at the rowdy merchants below, a glimmer of pity flashed through his mind. The reason he had to divide the items today was not at all what these merchants thought was the reason. Indeed, he wanted to test whether or not it was possible to dig out the 2 most profitable items from the Ming family's 8 large items and give them to Xiaofan. But, the truly important reason was actually thinking for these merchants. These merchants all thought that the 6 items left behind by the Cui family were already in their pockets, so they would not fight with the Ming family for them. However, in a moment, Xiaofan was certain to swallow all 6 of the Cui family's items into his stomach. These merchants could only eat those 2 pitiful items. Earlier, there had been reports that the Lingnan Xiong family and Chuanzhou Sun family had both prepared a large sum of silver and were sharpening their knives in preparation to accept the Cui family's route. In a moment, once all their efforts were in vain, these merchants would suffer a great loss. Because of the Cui family's collapse, the number of merchants who came to the palace treasury to bid today was 3 times more than in previous years. Fan Xian's original intention was for these merchants to have something to eat, which was why he had suggested dividing the items. Unexpectedly, no one appreciated it. Although he understood that these merchants did not know how the situation would develop in a moment, which was why they raised their opposition so forcefully, Fan Xian still found it difficult to suppress the sullen feeling in his heart. He argued a little more with Eunuch Huang and Guozheng beside him. After explaining for a while, he found that the merchants still insisted on doing things according to the usual practice of previous years. The other 3 officials were also dead set on the word rules, and did not dare to loosen their tongues. Fan Xian finally decided to give up. As the saying goes, retreat in order to advance. Sometimes, this was the logic. Deputy Ma Jia turned his head and glanced at Fan Xian with difficulty. Fan Xian waved his hand, indicating that the discussion was over. The merchants were overjoyed and all bowed deeply, saying that the imperial envoy was wise. Fan Xian looked at these merchants with cold eyes and couldn't resist shaking his head. He thought to himself, just don't cry in a moment. Xue Qing sat beside him and smiled slightly as he stroked his beard without saying anything. In reality, his gaze was focused on the room closest to the main hall and the room furthest away. At first, there was a lot of noise in the front, but the calmest were those 2 rooms. He knew Xiaofan was Fan Xian's person. However, He didn't know where Fan Xian had prepared the silver or how the Ming family was planning to respond. The bidding had not been going on for long. There were already merchants who began to regret it. The head of the Xiong family in Lingnan became the first pitiful fellow to almost cry. The Palace Treasury Transport Company officials stood on the high steps and gave a salute. Then, each room began to bid. Naturally, the bids could not be shouted out like bidding for girls in a brothel. 50 liang. 100 liang. When the court did things, there had to be some rules. For example, the merchants of North Cotton Yarn Road would, after the officials gave the salute, calculate last year's profit and this year's trend. They would have their own old shopkeepers make detailed calculations and then write down an accurate number on a piece of paper. They would seal it in a craft paper bag and have the transport company officials below deliver it to the flower hall on the left of the main hall. The merchants had 3 chances to bid, and they all opened open bids. If someone bid higher than them the first time, these merchants still had a chance to raise the price. In the end, the third bid would be the final one. It was a very simple rule for bidding: the highest bidder wins. Then, the merchants who won the bid had to, in the first instant, either joyfully or painfully, take out up to 40% of the deposit and deliver it to the flower hall. In the flower hall were the accountants of the transport company, as well as old accounting officials sent over by the Jingdo Ministry of Revenue. They were responsible for comparing the numbers each merchant brought up and inspecting the banknotes the merchants finally handed over. It had been many years since a merchant had stupidly brought a dozen boxes of silver to the bidding. From this point of view, the palace treasury bidding was not much different from bidding for a prostitute in a brothel. It was just that the girl in the palace treasury was a bit more expensive. Regardless of whether it was the merchants or the busy officials, they were no strangers to this scene. At this moment, in the courtyard, the officials were busily walking around, holding the envelopes each family had handed over. The officials of the Overwatch Council were vigilantly watching everything to prevent cheating that was already difficult to happen. At this time, the bid was for the wine category from the north. This was already the third bid. The person who came from the Lingnan Xiong family today was the current head of the family, Xiong Beiling. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. Looking at the previous 2 bids, the muscles on his face twitched. He wanted to cry but had no tears. The Lingnan Xiong family had always done business in the south of the Qing kingdom. Because of geographical and opportunity problems, they had never had the opportunity to extend their reach to the north, so it was difficult to open up business. This year, because of the fall of the Cui family, these merchants had the opportunity to seize the northern marketing rights, so Xiong Beiling was determined to win this bid. He was also the one who had opposed Fan Xian's division of the project the most. However, at this time, he began to regret it. He had clearly already had the clan prepare enough silver, but the previous 2 bids had been forcefully suppressed by someone else. Xiong Beiling's eyes were red. Anxiety attacked his heart. If he didn't win this bid, it wasn't just a matter of how much money he would earn this year. Rather, his family's march to the north around the Ming family would be forced to slow down. Thus, he hated the person who didn't follow the rules and dared to compete with him for the bid. Other than the hatred, there was also endless fear. He knew that person had the imperial envoy as a backer, but the problem was, where did he get so much money? B4. He looked hatefully at the quiet room in the back. Xia Qifei and his group in room B4 had been very quiet the entire time, but when it came to bidding, they were very vicious and merciless. Most importantly, they didn't know what kind of expert was helping them. They had calculated a year's profit in the north of the wine business so clearly, and they also had a clear estimate of his family's bottom line. The previous 2 bids, each bid had just happened to suppress him. For some reason, a feeling of defeat grew in Xiong Beiling's heart. Could it be that he, who had been in business for generations, was not as good as a bandit leader? At his side, the old shopkeeper's face was full of defeat and he reminded him, "Master, you can't go any higher. If you go any higher, then there won't be any profit." Xiong Bailing thought for a while, and a fierce light flashed in his eyes. The Xiong family earning money from this bid was a small matter. Opening up a trade route was the important matter. He decided to fight it out with the bandits in room B4. "Just give me this price." Xiong Bailing made a hand gesture and made up his mind to cut off all means of retreat. He gritted his teeth and said, "Bandits don't care about stolen silver, but there's no need to lose money to steal business from me." At this time, the courtyard had quieted down. It was the third bid, and there was no one else participating. Everyone's gaze was focused on the Lingnan Xiong family and room B4. Although Eunuch Huang and Guozheng had doubts in their hearts and glanced at Fan Xian, they still didn't pay enough attention to it. After all, this was only a small bid. Perhaps Fan Xian just wanted to fish for some profit. As long as it didn't hurt the Ming family or their interests, it was fine. The two officials each took out a leather envelope from the two rooms and silently entered the flower hall. Everyone waited anxiously for the result. Although this bid was not the biggest or most profitable of the 16, the people in the courtyard had already begun to feel something strange about room B4. Everyone wanted to know whether room B4 was here to fight for the bid or was the imperial envoy using it to raise the price. Room B4, Xia family, 370,000 liang, Win, the transport company official responsible for announcing the result, stood on the stone steps and expressionlessly sang out the result. His singing was very moving. Even the last, Win, swayed and sounded like he was singing on a stage. The courtyard immediately sank into a deathly silence. A moment later, everyone seemed to wake up from their shock and let out a heaven-shaking cry of surprise. 370,000 liang. However, to sell wine to the north, if it was calculated according to previous years, this would certainly be a loss. The Lingnan Xiong family had bid 300,000 liang, which was already a desperate bid. Who would have thought that they would still lose to room B4? However, with this, the merchants also understood one fact. Xia Qifei of room B4 was definitely not a shill used by the imperial envoy to raise the price. He was truly going to fight for business with them. For a moment, everyone didn't know whether to be happy or sad. At this time, a muffled sound came from the room of the Lingnan Xiong family. It seemed that something heavy had fallen from a chair to the ground. Everyone stared at the room with lingering fear. The master of the Xiong family, Xiong Bailing, climbed up from the ground. With great difficulty, he picked up a cup of cold tea and poured it into his stomach. Panting, he said, "That bastard, F***ck, to bid 370,000 liang. These bandits are indeed bandits. Even when doing business, they are still so bandit-like. You guys win." Fan Xian sat in the grand wooden chair in the hall with his head slightly lowered. He was not happy with this price. It was indeed too high. Originally, the first two bids had been very beautiful on Xia Qifei's side and just enough to beat the Xiong family by a head. This last bid had cost him an extra 70,000 liang of silver. No matter how much money he had, he couldn't afford to spend it like this. He sighed in his heart, but he knew that the bidding was certainly not Xia Qifei's decision. He had placed a few crafty Ministry of Revenue officials in room B4. They were experts he had secretly asked for from his father in Jingdo. However, it seemed that those officials had overestimated the determination of the Lingnan Xiong family. In a moment, a brocade box had been brought out from room B4 and handed over to the flower hall for inspection. It was indeed a full 150,000 liang of banknotes issued by Taiping Money House. The seal was not fake, and the old man was not deceived. At this moment, everyone knew that the person sitting in the quiet room B4 was a merchant among bandits. A bandit among merchants did not give any face when it came to bidding. It only knew how to use silver to smash people. Furthermore, the other party did indeed have this much silver. However, no one knew how many more bids the bandits in room B4 were prepared to take. The following development of the situation made everyone, other than the Ming family, feel hopeless. The leader of the Jiangnan water bandits, Xia Qifei, perfectly displayed the style of a bandit. Using the banknotes as a knife and the exquisite bidding as a fist, he forcefully carved out a bloody path in the midst of the crowd of merchants. Amidst the singing of the officials on the stone steps, the brocade box was endlessly handed into the flower hall. People seemed to see countless beautiful banknotes dancing in the air while Xia Qifei held a large knife and clamored lasciviously, "Who has more money than me?" 4 hours had passed. Other than missing an unimportant small bid, Xia Qifei had taken 4 bids in a row. Among them were the 3 bids that had originally belonged to the Chui family's northern route. Not only had he killed Xiong Beiling until he fell to the ground, he had also killed the Chuanzhou Sun family until their faces were deathly pale. The other merchants were even more frightened out of their wits. They thought to themselves that they had not come today to take bids, but to see bandits kill people. It was only now that the merchants regretted not accepting Fan Xian's initial proposal. If they split it up, there were still 10 more major bids. Even if the Ming family was eyeing them covetously, they would still have a chance to take a bite. They would rather shed all pretense of cordiality and fight with the Ming family than face off against the bandits in room B4. This was the Jiangnan merchant's biggest feeling today. Fan Xian sat in the grand wooden chair with a calm expression and spoke casually with Xue Qing. In reality, he was jealous of Xia Qifei in his heart. He thought to himself, why didn't this kind of cute game of using silver to smash people into the arena and make it so easy for him? Eunuch Huang and Guozheng had already shaken off the shock of a moment ago. They met each other's eyes with a not quite there smile. They were thinking the same thing. Fan Xian, where did all this silver come from? The Minister of Revenue in Jingdou was probably not clean. The 5th bid had begun. This was the northern route glassware that had originally belonged to the Chui family. The door to room B4 was pushed open again. Another brown paper bag was handed out. At this time, there were already no merchants willing to play with this bandit, so they were all quiet and only hoped that the bandit would eat his fill earlier. It was at this moment that the door to room A1, which had been unusually quiet, was pushed open. For some reason, the Ming family had made their move early. We don't need to win the bid, but we need to drag it out. At least drag it out until the end of the day. Ming Qingda closed his eyes to rest and said to his son beside him, the other party's momentum has already been formed. We need to be careful and give ourselves enough time to respond tonight. Ming Launcher was silent. He knew that his father was also beginning to worry about the seemingly bottomless amount of silver in room B4 and was preparing to raise it at night. Ming Qingda didn't open his eyes, but he was thinking about the bandit in room B4. Why did he make him so uneasy? That Xia Qifei, why did he look so familiar? The bandit in room B4 robbed the monthly tickets. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 365. First of all, a correction. The day before yesterday, it was B6. Yesterday, it became B4. I made a mistake. Thank you for your reminder. Hearing the news of the Ming family bidding, Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. It was as if he had not thought that the other party's response would come so quickly and with such shrewdness. In reality, his heart was still calm. This was something he had expected. The Ming family was not a pig waiting to be slaughtered. Although the matter had happened suddenly, someone as scheming in deep foresight as Ming Qingda would certainly have a better response. Eunuch Huang and Guozheng heard this news and their spirits rose. Their long-sitting buttocks finally moved forward a little and listened with anticipation to the sounds in the courtyard. Only Xueqing remained calm and collected as he tasted the tea in his bowl. This was already the fifth lot. It had never been one of the Ming family's goals, but they had chosen to bid at this time. Their goal was to stand out in this silent scene and suppress the arrogance of Xia Qifei and his group in room B4. More importantly, they were using a scoundrelly method to stall for time and slow down the process. Thus, this round of bidding seemed to be exceptionally boring, even boring. It was far less intense than the first round, when Xia Qifei and the Xiong clan of Lingnan clashed tit for tat, and it couldn't even compare to the previous rounds. The price the Ming family bid was very low. There was not a hint of sincerity to be seen. However, Ming Qingda did not care about this. With a face full of smiles, he watched his son and the shopkeepers of the clan drag out the time. This round of bidding took up a few quarters of an hour. When the Ming family calculated, they were as inexperienced as a beginner. When they called out a price, they were as shy as a virgin girl. When they handed over the leather bag, they were as inconvenient as a toothless old woman. In any case, they dragged it out as long as they could. From the master to the accounts room, they cooperated very well. It made everyone wait anxiously, but they could not find any problems. The transport company official responsible for announcing had already begun to stand on the stone steps and yawn. This fifth lot was not over yet. Xia Qifei's price had been suppressing the Ming family by a large margin, but the 3 rounds of bidding had not ended. No one could jump to the next round. The surrounding Jiangnan merchants began to chat and drink tea. These old foxes could all see what the old Ming master was planning. They knew that within today, they would probably only be able to open the 5th lot. The sun and the sky moved slowly but surely toward the west. The Ming family's speaking movements were slow and sloppy. A little bird landed in the middle of the courtyard and looked curiously at the people around it who were yawning and chatting. It did not seem to understand why everything in this courtyard seemed to be moving in slow motion. The Ming family was in no hurry. The Jiangnan merchants were in no hurry. Eunuch Huang and Guozheng were in no hurry. Governor Xueqing was even less anxious. He didn't know if the robbers in room B4 would go crazy when they encountered this kind of slow simmering skill. However, under everyone's careful scrutiny, Fan Xian hid the anxiety between his brows. His heart was clear, and he was full of praise for the Ming family's ruthless skills and shameless methods. The sun gradually descended toward the west, dragging the shadow of the palace treasury main door like a girl's dress. The little bird, which had not even found a blade of grass on the stone steps, raised its head and looked around. Full of hidden bitterness, it cooed a few times and flapped its wings to fly away. A gong rang out. The firecrackers that represented the successful end of the palace treasury bidding did not explode because the 3rd bidding for the 5th lot had just ended. Xia Qifei had once again arduously defeated the Ming family and obtained the right to sell glass in the north. At this moment, the first day of the palace treasury's New Year opening bidding was about to end. The merchants in the courtyard all let out a breath and stretched. They wiped away their cold sweat with some lingering fear. Fortunately, the Ming family had made a move in the end and forcefully dragged out the time. Otherwise, given the aura of room B4 at the beginning, who knew how many drops of soup would be left from the fat and overflowing 16 lots of the palace treasury? Eunuch Huang and Guozheng met each other's eyes and smiled gratifyingly. Xia Qifei's move had indeed surprised them. Fortunately, in the end, he had dragged out the other party's aura. Presumably, the Ming family would make proper arrangements for tomorrow's matters tonight. Fan Xian sat on the chair and lifted the stage over the high wall of the large courtyard. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the smear of red on the horizon, but he could no longer see the setting sun. The courtyard began to clear and seal the lots. The banknotes and tools that the merchants had brought in did not need to be taken out. For one, it was for convenience and another was for safety. Tonight, Jiangnan Road, the Overwatch Council, the transport company, and the Suzhou government would work together to guard this palace treasury courtyard tightly. It could be said to be the safest place in the world. The soldiers began to put seals on the rooms in the corridor and the outside of the flower hall. The merchants had already come out. They stood in the courtyard in groups of 3 to 5 and chatted. When they saw the old Ming master and young master Ming come out of room A1, everyone quickly went over to greet and bow. Everyone's voices were low, but the focus of their discussion was naturally the bandit in room B4. Xia Qifei's face was heavy. He led his subordinates to stand under the wall closest to the main door of the palace treasury courtyard. It was a patch of darkness. As everyone discussed, they looked in that direction. Looking at the group of people in the darkness, they thought of the bandits' methods earlier and felt a growing fear in their hearts. At this time, the 4 officials in the main hall also walked down. "Greetings, Yuna Kuang." "Greetings, Sir Shui." "Sir Fan Jr., you have to leave some food for me." All of a sudden, the merchants rushed forward and surrounded the 4 high-ranking officials. They greeted each other and complained about their troubles. It was a very lively scene. Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. Looking at the angry Xiong Bailing of the Lingnan Xiong family, he comforted him and then teased, "There are still 11 lots, what are you all in such a rush for?" The representatives of the various families cried out bitterly in their hearts. Of the remaining 11 lots, the Ming family was determined to win 8 of the bundled lots. How could they have any food for themselves? Fan Xian sighed again and said, "There are too few lots. There will always be people who won't get their turn. This is the rule of the court. I can't do anything about it." Hearing these words, everyone immediately thought of Fan Xian's initial suggestion. Hearing him mention the word "rule," their eyes involuntarily lit up. Xiong Bailing suddenly chuckled and said in a low voice, "This rule, isn't it set by people?" These merchants had not fought for any benefits today, so they couldn't help but feel a certain thirst for tomorrow's lots. Ming Qingda, who had been watching coldly from outside the crowd, furrowed his brows. He knew the imperial envoy was secretly urging the merchants to fight for shares with the Ming family. He laughed coldly in his heart, but on the surface, he smiled faintly and glanced at Yuna Kuang without anyone noticing. Yuna Kuang understood and smiled slightly as he interrupted, "Everyone, I also think the same." Everyone couldn't help but feel happy. They thought that even the representative of the palace had agreed to the suggestion of dividing the lots. It looked like this matter would succeed. Unexpectedly, Yuna Kuang then sighed and said, "Unfortunately, the rules of the court are here. No one dares to move on their own. This matter can only wait until I return to the capital and go to the Empress Dowager and the Emperor to argue for everyone. I dare say that next year will certainly be better than this year." Everyone paused. Their faces were very awkward, but in their hearts, they were cursing this eunuch for only saying pretty words. During this time, Fan Xian was talking to everyone, but in reality, his attention was on the Ming family. He found that the old Ming master's state of mind was still clear despite the sudden change. His emotions did not seem to have been affected at all. His judgment of matters was still fast and accurate. He couldn't help but feel a little worried. Since he wanted to force the Ming family to lose their heads, it looked like he would have to add more bargaining chips. All of the work of sealing the treasury had finally ended, and the defenses had been set up. The main doors of the palace treasury courtyard were slowly pulled open for the second time that day. The fresh air from the street poured into the courtyard and lifted everyone's spirits. They decided to go back at night to discuss things and come back tomorrow to fight for the lots. It had already come to this. Who cared if it was the Ming family or the Fan family, they had to steal some business to do. At this time, the large merchants had already heard from Fan Xian's few words the intentions of a certain faction in the court. They wanted to target the Ming family. There were benefits to lure them and power to guide them. The merchants began to drool over the Ming family that they had not dared to directly clash with. The leaders of the large families, led by the Lingnan Xiong family and the Quanzhou Sun family, met each other's eyes and smiled strangely. Amidst their laughter, they decided to eat together at Jiangnan restaurant that night. Everyone was secretly discussing how to steal the Ming family's lot. Of course, they were paying attention to the movements of the old Ming master. They found that the old Ming master was talking to the imperial envoy. One old and one young, the two of them had smiles on their faces and were incomparably intimate. Officials and merchants were actually both extremely hypocritical professions. Naturally, they would do this kind of superficial work, so no one was surprised. Just as they were about to leave, they saw the imperial envoy gently wave his hand and call over Xia Qifei and his group, who had remained in the shadows. The merchants all stopped their steps and looked curiously at the scene in front of them. Fan Xian's expression was calm as he gazed at Xia Qifei with a faint smile. His two hands were in front of his body and made a gesture that only the two of them understood. His mouth said, "Sir Xia, today you are in the limelight." Xia Qifei smiled and raised his hands in a greeting in all directions. It is all thanks to everyone's modesty. No matter how much the merchants hated him, they knew that he was, after all, a figure in the underworld. It was best not to offend him face to face. Furthermore, they could clearly see that this person was Imperial Envoy Fan Xian's trusted aide. Thus, they kept their faces and replied with a few words, saying that Sir Xia had not made a name for himself for 10 years and had shocked the world with a single brilliant feat. Ming Qingda narrowed his eyes and looked at the enemy who had suddenly appeared in front of him. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, "Master Xia, why are you suddenly interested in doing business?" The scene became silent. Xia Qifei lowered his head and only slowly raised it a moment later. Looking at the master of this generation of the Ming family, he said with a not quite there smile, "Although I have been on the Jianghu for a long time, my family has been in business for generations. When it comes to my generation, no matter how bad it is, I have to carry on my father's dying wish." Oh! The corners of Ming Qingda's eyes furrowed even more. He tiredly asked, "So, Master Xia is also a family of merchants? I didn't know you were a merchant from all over the world. Perhaps I once had a friendship with your father." All the merchants looked at this scene with curiosity. Hearing this conversation, they were also very curious about what Xia Qifei's family originally did. Xia Qifei gazed calmly at Ming Qingda's face that often appeared in his nightmares. An unknown emotion welled up in his heart. A moment later, the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. He quietly said, "Of course, there is friendship. My father is your father. Does Master Ming not know him?" The people present did not quite understand these words. Xiong Beiling began to unconsciously dig at his ears. Ming Qingda was slightly startled. He looked at Xia Qifei in front of him and did not speak. Although Xia Qifei didn't know why the imperial envoy wanted him to reveal his identity ahead of time, standing once again in front of the Ming family had been his strongest wish these years. Today, his dream had come true. It made his emotions surge with emotion. However, he still maintained his calm on the surface. It was just that his right hand, hanging by his side and hidden in his sleeve, was trembling slightly. He gazed at Ming Qingda and said in a light but faint voice, "Big brother, we haven't seen each other for a dozen years. Do you not recognize Shao Qi?" Xia Qifei was the 7th young master of the Ming family. He was the rumored 7th young master who should have inherited the Ming family business but had mysteriously disappeared in the end. All the merchants present looked at Xia Qifei in disbelief. It was as if they were looking at a fierce ghost crawling out of hell, a monster that should not exist in this world. How was this possible? Although no one dared to discuss it, everyone could guess that it was the old matriarch of the Ming family and the old Ming master in front of them who had killed the 7th young master. How could he still be alive and become the leader of the Jiangnan water bandits? Ming Qingda gazed in a daze at Xia Qifei in front of him. He stared at that face for an indeterminable amount of time. Suddenly, his body began to tremble. He finally saw a trace of a familiar shadow on this face. It was that young and inexperienced little brother from back then, that thin body that had been viciously beaten by him with a whip, and that face filled with hatred and the joy of revenge. Father. At this moment, Ming Lansher's heart was also filled with incomparable shock and fear. He looked like an idiot at Xia Qifei, the legendary uncle. He found that his father's body was already swaying and quickly went to support him. In Ming Lansher's view, this palace treasury courtyard was like a haunted house. He could not stay for long. Supporting his father, who seemed to have aged a great deal in an instant, he led the members of the clan out of the palace treasury courtyard. The merchants present were still staring at Xia Qifei with faces full of shock and quietly discussing something. When the Ming family walked to the front door, unexpectedly, the master of the Ming family, Ming Qingda, abruptly shook off his son's support and forced himself to stand straight, turning around. The master of the Ming family's face was slightly pale, but he used his powerful self-control to recover his temporary calm. He gazed at Xia Qifei in the courtyard and calmly said, "Master Xia must be joking. My poor seventh brother unfortunately died of illness a dozen years ago. Please do not say such a joke to provoke my heart." The merchants were silent. They knew it was fortunate that the old master of the Ming family had stopped and turned around to say these words. Otherwise, if, in their shock, they had revealed an opening and allowed this news to spread without anyone from the Ming family to refute it, the situation would become even more difficult to control. Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and looked at the old and tired master of the Ming family on the stone steps. He sighed in his heart and said, "What a pity, I admire you." To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 366. After the 25th, the monthly tickets will be doubled. Brothers and sisters who still have tickets, help me keep some. When the time comes, smash them. Thank you here, and then go eat. I wish everyone a happy weekend. Eat oysters at night, haha. For Fan Xian, it was a pity that Ming Qingda did not lose his composure in the face of the sudden attack he had hidden for a long time. His admiration was for the same reason. Xia Qifei's true past was definitely one of the most secretive matters in the world. The Ming family had no idea that the seventh young master was still alive in this world. After he had been saved by the old master of the Jiangnan water bandits, he had become the leader of the Jiangnan water bandits. The Ming family even had some business dealings with the Jiangnan water bandits. If Ming Qingda had known of Xia Qifei's identity earlier, he would probably have long thought of a way to deal with him. Facing the seventh young master who had appeared like a ghost, the current master of the Ming family was only slightly startled. At least he recovered his calm on the surface. No wonder he was the wealthiest man in the Qin kingdom, the head of a large Jiangnan family. Although the Ming family had deep connections in Jingdo, it was impossible for them to know this. Even Fan Xian had only begun to focus his research on the Ming family after he had drawn up this year's plan last autumn. Only then did he find a sliver of a crack he could use in the iron plate that was Jiangnan. Of course, this was all thanks to the current head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, and Sir Yan Jr.'s ability to summarize, analyze, and meticulously track down information. It was this normally quiet high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council who had successfully dug out Xia Qifei's most secretive past. If Yan Bingyun had not helped Fan Xian take care of his foundation beforehand, Fan Xian's trip to Jiangnan this time would not have been so relaxed and confident. The group of people from the Ming family suppressed the shock in their hearts and silently left the door of the palace treasury manor. They walked out of the street that had been sealed off by soldiers. A carriage had long since come up to receive them and drove toward Ming Garden outside the city. No one knew how chaotic Ming Garden would be tonight because of the news of the seventh young master's sudden resurrection, or how the Ming family would respond. Fan Xian stood at the door of the manor and watched with a slight smile as the Ming family's carriage disappeared into the dusk. Seeing this, the officials behind him and the Jiangnan merchants couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts. They felt that the slight smile on the corners of the imperial envoy's lips was incomparably cold and cold-blooded. Everyone couldn't resist glancing at Xia Qifei a few more times. It was as if they still could not connect the head bandit of the Jiangnan water bandits with the seventh young master that the Ming family had thought dead many years ago. They knew that with the imperial envoy as a backer and the legendary wolf from back then, there would be a fight over the Ming family's enormous fortune. Although the Ming family could completely deny it, the matter would eventually become intense. What kind of benefits could the Jiangnan merchants gain from this? Xiong Beiling of Lingnan and Sun Jixiang of Quanzhou looked at each other. They were both thinking, for tonight's gathering at Jiangnan restaurant, should they invite another person? However, today's cards had been flipped too suddenly. The Jiangnan merchants could not make up their minds for a moment. Furthermore, to extend a hand to Xia Qifei at this time would be too rash. Besides, they didn't know what this seventh master Xia was thinking. Fan Xian did not know what Xia Qifei was thinking. He only knew that in the action manual that Yan Bingyun had drawn up for him, the Jiangnan trip should be split into two groups. Attacking the Ming family, then the other merchants had to be appeased. Xia Qifei had taken so many bids today and was already faintly forcing the Jiangnan merchants to unite and begin fighting for food with the Ming family tomorrow. Once Xia Qifei's identity, which could not be verified, was revealed, the Jiangnan merchants should be able to smell the conspiracy and opportunity within. Danger and opportunity had always been a pair. Merchants had an innate sense of adventure. Thus, Fan Xian gave Xia Qifei a hand signal. He saw Xia Qifei walk in front of Xiong Beiling and Sun Jixiang with a face full of smiles. Under their startled gazes, he quietly said a few words. The merchants all laughed lightly as if they were talking about a very interesting topic. Then, everyone dispersed and left the street. Fan Xian turned around and said a few words to Xueqing and Yuna Kuang. He glanced at Guozheng and then left first under the protection of the tiger guards. As he left, he turned his head back and swept a glance out of the corner of his eye. He saw that although Xia Qifei did not leave in the same direction as the merchants, he knew that there would be a chair for Xia Qifei at the Jiangnan gathering in a moment. The Ming family was at a disadvantage. The Ming family was being furiously attacked by Fan Xian. However, as representatives of the Ming family's backing, Yuna Kuang and Guozheng did not seem to be excited or concerned. The two of them smiled slightly and bowed to Governor Xueqing and quietly said a few words. Xueqing furrowed his brows slightly and shook his head. He put his hands behind his back and climbed into his sedan chair to leave. At this moment, only Yuna Kuang and Imperial Censor Guozheng remained in front of the large courtyard. They watched with narrowed eyes as the Jiangnan governor's sedan chair gradually turned the corner. Their expressions immediately became ugly. Guozheng coldly said, "This governor does things too carefully. What is there to be afraid of in a joint petition?" Yuna Kuang chuckled and said, "Sir Guo, how many people in this world can shoulder righteousness like you? Last year, in the Great Hall of the Ministry of Justice, you did not fear the nobility and interrogated Fan Xian. The palace greatly admired this matter." Guozheng laughed self-mockingly and said, "Don't mention that matter." Yuna Kuang calmed down and said in a quiet voice, "Xueqing has always been deeply trusted by the emperor. In officialdom, this person is the most slick and difficult to fathom. This time, Fan Xian secretly sent Xia Qifei out to seize the bid. You are the imperial censor, you can write rumors, but, after all, there is no way to hold on to solid evidence. Xueqing will certainly not participate in this. My question earlier was just to test his attitude. You also know that the place we are looking at is not in Jiangnan. Guozheng smiled slightly and replied, naturally, officials are not allowed to do business. This rule has been set by the court for many years. Which official has actually followed it? Even if Xia Qifei is Fan Xian's pawn, if we grab solid evidence and bring it to the court, I'm afraid the emperor will just laugh it off and not care about it in the past few years. Now that Fan Xian is heavily favored by the emperor, there will be even less of a problem. The two of them met each other's eyes again. Guozheng continued to smile and said, the Jiangnan matter will eventually end in Jingdou. Eunuch, where do you think Fan Xian got so much silver? Although we can't find out how the silver came to Jiangnan, we can at least find out if the room that should have been filled with silver has been emptied out by the Fan family at this time. Eunuch Huang chuckled darkly and said, those masters in the palace were thinking this way. Let the imperial envoy do as he pleases in Jiangnan. In a few days, the capital will probably start investigating the Ministry of Revenue. Fan Xian stood in Hua Garden's study with his body leaning forward. He looked at the little hand on the desk holding a brush and writing seriously. Among such an old child, the third prince's handwriting could be considered pretty good. It was graceful but not gentle. The structure was strong but round on the outside. It was contained but not revealed, strong but not released. Judging a person by his handwriting, Fan Xian knew that this prince, who always liked to wear a shy smile on his face, was not a simple character. However, he was still young and there were many things he could not see clearly. Other than dealing with Jiangnan matters, Fan Xian's most important job was to fulfill his duty as the Imperial College's Sai and be responsible for the third prince's studies and cultivation. As for the third prince's studies, a few days ago, Xueqing had kindly invited a famous Jiangnan teacher to come and teach the third prince. In the end, he had been kicked out of the door by the third prince. After Fan Xian returned to Suzhou and heard of this matter, he flew into a rage and led the third prince to personally go to the Jiangnan Academy to apologize to the teachers. With kind words, he invited the teachers back into Hua Garden. He then locked the third prince in his study and viciously slapped his palms a few times. When the ruler landed on the palm, the sound was crisp. Particularly when it landed on the third prince's palm, the ruler felt even more arrogant and proud. By the time Xueqing heard of this matter and rushed over, the slap had already been finished. The governor looked at the third prince, whose eyes were red but was still obedient, and couldn't help his heart being shocked. Although Fan Xian was the prince's teacher that the emperor had personally appointed, to actually hit him, this Sir Fan Jr. was indeed extraordinarily daring. After this matter was announced, the Jiangnan scholars all praised the imperial envoy as indeed the light of scholars. To be so respectful to his teacher, Fan Xian's already good reputation became even more beautiful. What everyone didn't know was that Fan Xian teaching the third prince had nothing to do with the emperor. It was purely because he didn't want to fail Yi Guipin's solemn request. Your Highness, it's almost done, Fan Xian said in a gentle voice as he gazed at the third prince, who was bent over the table and writing seriously. Teacher, there are still 2 more pages. The third prince turned his head in astonishment. It was as if he had not expected Fan Xian to be so gentle today. Fan Xian smiled and said, your palm still hurts, right? You can make it up tomorrow. Rest a bit today and go out to play. He rubbed the third prince's head. This action appeared a bit too intimate. Even if he was a teacher, logically speaking, he should be sitting upright and serious. Yet, the third prince liked this. Perhaps the children who grew up in the palace all had some contact deficiency, whether it was physically or mentally. The little guy smiled and bowed. He then ran out of the room. He ran so fast that no one knew what fun things were waiting for him in Ming Garden. Watching the third prince's departing figure, for some reason, Fan Xian's heart felt a bit empty. He began to miss his brother far away in Shangjing in northern Qi. Wang Qinian had written to say that Xia had recently been busy, with the help of the Overwatch Council, consolidating the Chui family's routes in the north. However, it was impossible for a seventh leaf to leave the country. It was indeed difficult for a young man like him to manage such an important matter. As for why the third prince had left so excitedly, Fan Xian understood the reason. It was because he had the third prince pester Haitang these few days. Given the prince's status, if he wanted to enter the Tianyi Dao sect, presumably he would not be too opposed. Even if this matter was not handled properly in the future, it would be beneficial for the third prince to learn some martial arts from Haitang to protect himself and forcefully put together a master-disciple relationship. A knocking sound came from outside the study. Fan Xian woke up from his thoughts and raised his head to look. He saw Shichan standing with his head turned to look into the garden. His fingers were unconsciously knocking on the door. He couldn't resist smiling and said, "Come in, what's there to see?" Shichan forced a smile and walked in through the door. "Teacher, to have the third prince learn martial arts from Haitang is truly something only you would dare to do. She is, after all, the saint girl of northern Qi. If this matter gets out to the capital, I'm afraid it will cause a great deal of trouble." "What trouble?" Fan Xian smiled. "The emperor told me to take the third prince to Jiangnan. Of course, I have to teach him with all my heart. As for things like martial arts, Haitang is more suitable than me." The two of them no longer discussed this topic. Shichan said with a pained expression, "Today, Yang Jimei came again and insisted on inviting me to dinner." Yang Jimei was the largest salt merchant in the area between the two rivers. The Hua garden that Fan Xian lived in had been given to him by this salt merchant. Fan Xian knew that this salt merchant was close to Xueqing, so he always gave him some face. Hearing Shichan say this, he knew that although Yang Jimei had not earned much this year, he had great hopes for the palace treasury next year. He smiled and said, "This garden is his family's. If he wants to come and see, of course, we can't refuse. He knows that he can't curry favor with me, so he can only curry favor with you. Let him eat. In the future, you will also be doing business in Jiangnan. It will always be good to know a few local tyrants." "Where is he preparing to invite you?" Fan Xian asked. "Jiangnan Restaurant." The highest class restaurants in Suzhou were Jiangnan Restaurant and Zhuyuan Restaurant. When Fan Xian had first arrived in Suzhou, the Jiangnan officials led by Xueqing had chosen Jiangnan Restaurant to welcome him. Presently, the Ming family's Zhuyuan Restaurant had been half bought and half scared into the hands of the third prince and was prepared to be turned into a branch of the Baoyue brothel. If Yang Jimei wanted to invite someone, it could only be at Jiangnan Restaurant. Fan Xian thought to himself that his question was indeed unnecessary. He thought for a moment and then said, "Today, the Jiangnan merchants have also decided to meet at Jiangnan Restaurant. The Ming family has to deal with the matter of Xia Qifei, so they probably won't send anyone to attend. Yang Jimei insisted on inviting you to dinner. He certainly wants to use this opportunity to build connections with the royal merchants. Give this opportunity to Yang Jimei. When the time comes, bring him to the banquet." Presently, everyone in Suzhou knew that the head shopkeeper of the Baoyue brothel branch, Shichan, was actually Fan Xian's confidant. With Shichan acting as a middleman, the royal merchants would certainly be happy to accept Yang Jimei's arrival. Of course, Fan Xian's thoughts were not just to return a favor to Yang Jimei and Xueqing. He also had other arrangements. "At the banquet, keep your ears open," Fan Xian said. "The Ming family is not present, so the royal merchants will not avoid you. Perhaps they will purposely use your ears to send their plans for tomorrow to me." Shichan nodded. In reality, he was still a bit nervous. Should I keep an eye on Xia Qifei? After staying with Fan Xian for a long time, Shichan, who usually only knew how to study the books of the saints, had also become used to viewing everything in the world through the eyes of a conspiracy theory. These words clearly showed that he did not trust Xia Qifei. Fan Xian smiled and said, "Relax, Xia Qifei is a smart person. He won't be stupid enough to betray me at this time. This will not benefit him at all." Shi Chanli smiled with slight embarrassment and then asked, "Sir, do you have any words that you want me to bring to the Jiangnan royal merchants?" Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. "Just say that I support them to do as they please. Even if they completely empty out this year, I will compensate them next year." He raised his head and warned, "Of course, you have to dress up your words a bit. Don't say it too plainly." Shi Chanli accepted the order and was about to leave when he suddenly remembered something Yang Jimei had mysteriously mentioned earlier. After thinking for a bit, he still opened his mouth and said, "Earlier, Yang Jimei said that there is an organization in Jiangnan called the Juanshan Conference. Its power is somewhat mysterious and unfathomable. Please be careful, sir." Fan Xian thought for a bit and felt that the name Juanshan Conference was unfamiliar. It seemed that there was no record of it in the Overwatch Council's files. He furrowed his brows and said, "Mysterious does not necessarily mean powerful." "I understand." After Shi Chanli left, Fan Xian's brows furrowed even tighter. An organization that even he didn't know about, what exactly did it represent? He called out. Gao De, who had been standing guard outside the door, walked in with large steps. Nowadays, Fan Xian was doing things less and less without avoiding him. One reason was to purposely use the tiger guards to show sincerity to the person on the dragon chair in the capital. The other reason was to try the words, moving people with emotion, and see if it was possible to truly turn these powerful tiger guards into truly one of us. He had Gao De call over the head swordsman of the 6th Bureau. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said to the subordinate, "How many people are there in Suzhou?" He was asking about the number of assassins and swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. The emperor had only moved a few tiger guards over. They either stayed by Fan Xian's side or stayed behind the third prince. They could not be moved. Most of the assassins of the 6th Bureau were under the Shadow's lead. They were all over Jiangnan fighting guerrilla warfare against the group of aces sent by Dongyi. For a time, the number of people Fan Xian could move became somewhat inconvenient. The 6th Bureau still has 7 people. There are quite a few people from the 4th Bureau of Inspection stationed in Suzhou, the subordinate replied in a low voice. Presently, the head of the Qinian unit, Wang Qinian, was in northern Qi, Deng Ziyu was in Jingdou, and Su Wenmao had been left behind by Fan Xian in the 3 workshops of the palace treasury in North Min. Thus, this person was currently Fan Xian's most direct subordinate. Coincidentally, he had also come from the 6th Bureau, so he was the person in the Qinian unit most skilled in defense. "Don't move the people of the 4th Bureau," Fan Xian sighed and said. Fan Xian sighed and said, "They are not good at fighting and killing. If there are any losses and Yan Bingyun knows that I used his people indiscriminately, given his personality, I really don't know how he will react. After I return to the capital, I will be criticized." Gao De and the member of the Qinian unit, who were listening to the side, both laughed. The subordinate asked with confusion, "Sir, what are we doing today?" "To protect someone," Fan Xian said in a low voice. Fan Xian said in a heavy voice, "Take the 7 swordsmen of the 6th Bureau and hurry to Jiangnan restaurant. Find Xia Qifei and tell him directly that these are the guards I gave him. At the same time, tell him not to be suspicious. Once the palace treasury bidding is over, I will immediately take them back." No one knew whether or not Fan Xian had placed spies by Xia Qifei's side. At least on the surface, other than a few old officials of the Ministry of Revenue, the Overwatch Council did not monitor Xia Qifei's every move. This was the way the two sides interacted. Thus, Fan Xian had decided to move people to Xia Qifei's side. He had to at least give a word or two of explanation. The subordinate furrowed his brows and said, "Sir, if they are all moved over, what about you and the third prince?" Fan Xian glanced at Gao De and smiled confidently. "Naturally, Sir Gao will worry about my safety. Your mission is to ensure that before the palace treasury bidding, Xia Qifei himself is not harmed in the slightest." Hearing these words, Gao De gripped the hilt of his knife and bowed. The subordinate did not continue to ask questions. He calmly accepted the order and prepared to open the door to make arrangements. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and suddenly said, "Be careful." The old matriarch of the Ming family seemed to be in a very bad mood. She didn't even take a sip of her daily nourishing pigeon soup. She sent it back to the little kitchen untouched. After the Ming master and young master returned from Suzhou, they went straight into the back garden and had not come out. The uncles and nephews of each branch also received their orders. With faces full of worry, they passed through the beautiful corridors and pavilions by the lake in Ming Garden and hurried toward the old matriarch's courtyard. The servant girls with heads full of confusion watched as the fourth master, who only liked to walk his bird, the third master, who only liked to take concubines, and the sixth master, who only liked to practice wrestling with martial artists and win lotteries. They walked hurriedly and with unsure expressions. It was usually difficult for the men of the Ming family to gather together. At this time, they had all arrived. They couldn't help but be confused. What had happened? For a moment, the entire Ming garden was enveloped in a tense and uneasy atmosphere. The speed at which rumors spread was always faster than the mail system that the Qin kingdom was so proud of. Before long, all of the servants in Ming Garden learned of a startling piece of news. It turned out that at the palace treasury bidding in Suzhou, an enemy who dared to oppose the Ming family had suddenly appeared. That enemy was the legendary seventh young master of the Ming family who had died many years ago. Back then, the previous master of the Ming family had loved the seventh young master's mother the most. In his will, it seemed that most of the property had been left to the seventh young master with a wretched fate. However, after all these years, the Ming family had long become the property of the eldest branch. Now that such a person had suddenly appeared, what exactly would happen? "Everyone, calm down." The wrinkled old matriarch looked coldly at the men of the Ming family in the hall. A great anger surged in her heart. These men were so flustered at such a small matter. After 100 years, how could she peacefully hand over such a large family property to them? "Sister," with such a rumor suddenly appearing, it's no wonder the children are panicking. Sitting beside the old Ming matriarch was the old master's concubine. Because she had fawned over the main wife well, she had lived until today. She looked at the old Ming matriarch's face and said in a trembling voice, "If that Xia person is really Shao Qi, what do we do?" To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 367. This chapter was difficult to write, so it was later. Tomorrow's chapter would probably be even more difficult, so the update would also be slightly later. Since you know it's just a rumor, then what is there to panic about? The old Ming matriarch screamed angrily. The old woman's voice had become sharp because of a strange sense of humiliation. It was as terrifying as the tip of a knife scratching across a piece of porcelain. The great-aunt sitting by her side was scared stiff. She quickly and obediently sat back in her chair, not daring to say another word. The old Ming matriarch was easily jealous and ruthless. Back then, the old Ming master had only taken 3 concubines. Of the people of that generation, there were only 2 women left. Fortunately, the Ming family had a thriving male population. Not counting Xia Qifei, who was currently drinking in Jiangnan restaurant, there were a total of 6 men in the 2 branches with children. Ming Qingda was the eldest son of the eldest branch and the current master of the Ming family. The third and fourth brothers were both born of this great-aunt. Seeing their birth mother being yelled at by the old matriarch, these two did not feel very comfortable in their hearts. However, the old matriarch had accumulated power for a long time, so no one dared to argue. As the eldest son, Ming Qingda had to come out and say a few warm words of explanation in this situation. Unexpectedly, the old Ming matriarch did not even pay attention to this nominal master of the Ming family. With a cold face, she said, "Remember all of this. The seventh of the Ming family died a dozen years ago. As for the current master Xia in Suzhou, if he wants to use the rumor from a dozen years ago to cause trouble, the Ming family will not tolerate him." Ming Qingda had been rebuffed, but he still wore a smile on his face. Warmly, he said, "Mother, naturally, no one will believe such an absurd rumor. However, what if the court wants to believe it?" These words were spoken very directly. Xia Qifei was Fan Xian's pawn. If the court power Fan Xian represented wanted to use this opportunity to take over the Ming family's enormous property and power without bloodshed, this kind of situation would be the most dangerous. The old matriarch blinked her slightly muddy eyes and said with disgust, "Just because that Fan official says so? Does the court not listen to reason?" Ming Qingda thought to himself, when has the court ever been reasonable? However, in the past, the court had always stood on the side of the Ming family. Thus, the Ming family of all reason and the hardest fist had always been the Ming family. If there was a disagreement within the court, the Ming family's fist had already endured the pain and cut itself off. This reasoning was probably even more difficult to explain. He smiled bitterly and said, "Mother, please tell me." Xia Qifei's momentum was ferocious. Looking at the appearance of the bidding today, he had brought a lot of money. Furthermore, he had the support of the imperial envoy. As for how the Ming family would respond, it would require the old Ming matriarch to draw up a plan. She did not directly answer Ming Qingda's question. She only stared at the Ming family disciples in the yard and said in a cold voice, "The situation today is not the same as in the past. A few days ago, I had Lan Shi go to each branch to see you uncles and have you be more well-behaved. Today, I will repeat it again. At this time, do not bring any trouble to the Ming family. If you want to walk your birds, then walk them at home. Chase all those hooligans who only know how to wrestle out of the garden. Also, no one is allowed to spread this matter. If I hear anyone gossiping behind my back, be careful that I don't pull your tongues out." The old Ming matriarch's words were hurried and angry. She actually began to cough. The serving girl behind her quickly gave her a gentle pat on the back. Beside her, Zhang Sun Ming Launcher quickly and respectfully handed over a bowl of tea. The Ming family disciples in the yard all bowed down, not daring to disobey the old matriarch's orders. Ming Qingda glanced at his mother. He wanted to say something but stopped himself. The old Ming matriarch laughed coldly in her heart. When her son did things, he lacked decisiveness. She always had to be the bad guy. She took a shallow sip of tea and indifferently opened her mouth to say, "Tomorrow is the second day of the bidding. As you all know, the imperial envoy is targeting our family. The next 8 lots will be bundled into 2 batches. It looks like the price will be much higher than in previous years. There is only one night. If we go to the money house now to issue the tickets, I'm afraid it will already be too late. At this time, you brothers should go back and gather up the private money in your rooms and hand it over to the accounts in a bit." Once these words came out, the men of the Ming family in the yard were immediately dumbfounded. Not being allowed to walk their birds and wrestle was just a temporary boredom. Anyone could endure it, but why did they have to use their pitifully small private money to travel to and fro? Every year when the palace treasury opened the bids, the family would always prepare enough silver. If the prices of those 8 lots were ridiculously high, then they could just not fight. Why was there a need to work so hard? The court would not set an upper limit. Who would know how much silver had to be stuffed in? These men were born with a golden spoon in their mouths, but they did not have the right to inherit. They only knew how to enjoy life. How could they know the true meaning of the palace treasury bidding for the Ming family? Behind it was hidden the power struggle within the court. Hearing the old matriarch's words, they unconsciously did not want to agree. The sixth master of the Ming family was younger and liked to wrestle, so he was braver. Gathering his courage, he said, "Mother, us brothers have never been able to participate in the family business. We all live on a monthly basis and each have a large family to support. Even if we have some private money, if we use that pitiful amount of silver to fill in, I'm afraid, it won't be of much use. It would be better." Before he finished speaking, a teacup had already been smashed to pieces in front of him with a crisp sound. The sixth master jumped in fright and his body trembled. Looking at the old matriarch's expression, he was so frightened that his legs weakened and he knelt down. The old matriarch looked at him faintly and coldly and said, "Pitiful silver? Do you think I don't know how much you've gained from the public business these years? Your in-laws are all famous rich people in Suzhou. Before, I pretended I didn't see it because you are, after all, the flesh and blood of the Ming family. According to the ancestors' rules, you are not allowed to take over the family business. Seeing that you are pitiful, it is fine to gain some silver, but, what is the situation now? All of you kneel and listen to me." After these words came out, everyone, including Ming Qingda, knelt in front of the two armchairs. The old matriarch's voice was like a venomous snake's tongue, making one shiver even though it was not cold. "If the big tree collapses, will it be any good for you monkeys? I will say it clearly. If the bidding tomorrow is not successful, even if the Ming family can hold out for a few more years, in the end, we will only be reduced to scattered ashes. At this time, we cannot be allowed to retreat. We can only advance. At this juncture, don't even think about hiding." The great-aunt looked with heartache at her son in the court. She leaned over and comforted, "Sister, don't be angry, they know what to do." The men of the Ming family in the court were frightened. They pounded their heads like garlic and repeatedly admitted their wrongs. "It's good that you know your wrongs." The old Ming matriarch slowly leaned back in the chair. Her eyelid seemed to close slightly as she said, "In a moment, you will all go back. No matter what method you use, before dawn tomorrow, hand over the silver to the accounts room. Each room 200,000 liang, old 150,000 liang." After these words came out, the second, fourth, and fifth princes did not have any objections. Although they still felt heartache, the third prince was not going to let it go. He straightened his neck and said, "Mother, why does old six only have to pay 150,000 liang?" The old matriarch glared at him and said, "Old six is the youngest. These 2 years, he has been in contact with the garrison. He likes to wrestle and spends more silver. As the older brother, why are you fussing with him?" The third prince snorted heavily from his nose and said unhappily, "Have I never spent silver on a daily basis?" In reality, everyone knew that this was the old matriarch feeling bad for her youngest son. However, anyone could say this except for the third prince, because he was the great-aunt's own son. The great-aunt saw that the situation was not good and repeatedly signaled to the third prince with her eyes. Recently, the third prince's silver had not been easy to use, so he stubbornly refused to lower his head. The old matriarch flew into a rage and scolded, "You only know how to spend silver in the brothel and even by those whores back home. Is there any reason to spend this silver?" From the wretched experience of Xia Qifei and his mother, it could be seen that the old matriarch had a very persistent dislike for some of the hobbies of men. "What about Big Brother? I am the eldest wife." Ming Qingda knelt on the ground and looked at his brothers with a slight smile. "Naturally, I have to put in a bit more effort. I accept 500,000 liang." Hearing the eldest brother say this, the brothers could not say anything more. The Ming garden family gathering immediately dispersed. The brothers quickly left the garden to gather the silver. Although they did indeed have a lot of private money hidden away, to gather this amount in one night was indeed very difficult. As the third prince of the Ming family followed his brothers outside, he cried about being poor and hoped that his brothers could help. At this time, everyone had their hands full. Furthermore, in front of the old Ming matriarch's strict orders, no one dared to be careless. How could they care about him? Time is too tight. At this time, the great-aunt had also returned to her own courtyard. In the old matriarch's courtyard, there was only one branch of the eldest wife. Ming Qingda furrowed his brows slightly and said, "The imperial envoy's move was too sudden. It didn't give us much time to react." The old Ming matriarch glanced at her son and sighed. "Today, in the palace treasury manor, your reaction was not bad. At least, you managed to buy one more night of time." Ming Qingda smiled bitterly and shook his head. One night is too short. Furthermore, looking at Xia Qifei's actions today, I'm afraid he still has a lot of strength left. The battle tomorrow will probably be very dangerous. Even if the brothers can gather enough silver, it will only be an extra 1 million liang. Perhaps it still won't be enough. To the side, Ming Launcher was flabbergasted and said with self-doubt, "Father, in the past 8 lots, 40% of the fixed silver was a share of 5 million liang. This year, we had already prepared an extra 20%. In addition to the 1 million liang that the uncles raised, is it still not enough?" Ming Qingda smiled bitterly and said, "The biggest problem is that the imperial envoy knows that we have to win these 8 lots, so Xia Qifei can randomly call out prices. Furthermore, production and sales are all internal matters, so they can do it at a loss." Ming Launcher sighed. He was a smart person. He would not ask why the Ming family had to win these lots. Putting aside the so-called power problem, Dongyi alone would demand that they win all 8 lots. Otherwise, the price that Dongyi had to pay for the palace treasury's production each year would probably far exceed a few million liang. "Is there any news from Taiping Money House?" The old Ming matriarch, who had been silent for a while, suddenly opened her mouth and asked. Ming Qingda calmly replied, "They also did not expect it to be like this and did not prepare enough. Xia Qifei's silver was all transferred out from Taiping Money House. Presently, they can only give us promissory notes, but they can't issue cash notes. Tomorrow, we must have cash notes. As you know, they also have their fears. Earlier, their shopkeeper had already sent word. At most, he can give me another 300,000 liang." The old Ming matriarch understood why this was so. Once a money house's banknote contract was issued, it had to be honored. Xia Qifei had already issued a large amount of banknotes. Correspondingly, there were very few that dared to issue more. The money house had to guarantee that there would be cash to pay. This matter concerned the most important problem of the money house's reputation. Of course, given the relationship between Dongyi and the Ming family, if it was not under such a tense situation, Taiping Money House could completely issue fake banknotes. However, the risk was too great, and this method was too crude. Once they offended Fan Xian, the Palace Treasury Transport Company could use the Xia family's banknotes and the Ming family's banknotes to play the most shameless move of making a run. So much silver, even if Taiping Money House was an immortal, they would not be able to move it to Suzhou in such a short amount of time. If they did, Taiping Money House could be considered destroyed. Although Taiping Money House had close economic ties to each country, normally speaking, no country's internal palace would do such a ruthless thing. However, the person hosting the palace treasury bidding this time was Fan Xian, the one who was the most unclear of relationships and the most ruthless and tyrannical in his actions. Taiping Money House would not take such a risk even if they were beaten to death. The courtyard immediately sank into a deathly silence. The hearts of the third generation of the Ming family began to feel nervous. Would they really have to watch the seventh Ming master steal away the Ming family's business tomorrow? After losing the right to market the palace treasury, the Ming family was just a landlord with the most land and could be slaughtered at any moment. This terrifying reality made the old Ming matriarch's brows furrow even deeper. She suddenly thought of a name and coldly said, "Recently, has there been anyone from Xiaofan Money House who has come?" Ming Launcher shook his head. "They know we are a large customer of Taiping Money House. They probed a few times and probably knew they couldn't move us, so they backed off." The old Ming matriarch unconsciously nodded her head and said, "It looks like, it is not as I imagined." Because the accounts of Taiping Money House had always been in the hands of the old Ming matriarch, Ming Qingda had always strongly advocated a relationship with Xiaofan Money House. Hearing his mother's words soften a little, his heart leaped with joy, but his expression was calm. They should be trustworthy. If there really is a problem, it shouldn't be this way of doing things. The old Ming matriarch furrowed her brows as if she was thinking about a difficult problem. After a long time, she said, "Send someone to Xiaofan Money House." "No, don't send anyone. Launcher, go personally. See how much cash they can pull out tonight." "Yes, mother." Ming Qingda smiled slightly and then asked hesitantly, "How do we deal with Xia Qifei?" The old Ming matriarch's face became cold. "I don't know that person, you don't know him, and the Ming family doesn't know him. Since it is so, how do we deal with him? Don't get involved in this matter. Don't let the imperial envoy take the lead. Right now, the imperial envoy hopes that the Ming family will react fiercely, so we should be increasingly calm." Ming Qingda bowed deeply to the ground and sighed in admiration. Mother is wise. Ming Qingda had to deal with the matters of tomorrow's bidding and go to the account's house to keep an eye on his brothers. Ming Launcher had to go into the city to find the mysterious Xiaofan Money House that was rumored to have a dongy background. Thus, he did not stay long in the courtyard. After bowing, he retreated. The old Ming matriarch watched her son and grandson walk out of the little courtyard. Her eyes abruptly changed from the previous sternness to the present tiredness. She raised her pinky weakly and knocked on the armrest of the chair. The personal serving girl moved closer to the old woman's lips. The old woman closed her eyes. Her pinky remained raised for a long time. She did not put it down, nor did she speak. It was as if she was weighing something important. "Xiaoqi?" At this moment, a dark image seemed to rise in the old woman's tightly closed eyes. In the image, a woman with a face full of foxy charm was tossing and turning happily under a familiar man's body. She was smiling boastfully and proudly in front of her. The image changed. The woman had given birth to a child. She held the young infant and swaggered around Ming Garden. Her laughter was like a silver bell, floating and floating, all the way to the sky. The old woman suddenly opened her eyes filled with an ice-cold intent. Her pinky moved agitatedly, bending slightly. In this instant, she thought of many things from the past, such as when those heavy staffs landed on the woman's body, the beautiful scene of blood flying. That woman had been forced to the bottom of the well by her. The snowflakes on that day had also floated and floated all the way to the sky. That woman's body had probably long become dry bones. When a mouse crawled on top, it would only make unpleasant sounds. It would never be able to make a silvery bell-like laughter, right? After that old bastard died, she had the final say in the family. That woman had died, but it was not easy to kill the child she gave birth to. After all, he was the flesh and blood of the Ming family in name. Fortunately, Qingda was ruthless and used a whip to beat him every day. Finally, the child could not stand the humiliation and pain and ran out of Ming Garden one morning. Perhaps that child would never know that at that time, she had been watching him coldly from behind the door. Perhaps that child would never know that she had long prepared a killer and was waiting outside Ming Garden to send him down the dry well and reunite with his mother. But, how come that child did not die? Why did he not die? A glimmer of anger flashed through the old Ming matriarch's cold eyes. The fingers that had been perked up and slightly bent finally gently rested on the back of the chair. At the same time, her slightly dry lips opened slightly. She said in a quiet voice to the serving girl by her lips, "Please, Sir Zhou." When the old Ming matriarch finally made up her mind, her son and grandson were walking side by side. Ming Launcher gazed at his father with a face full of admiration and said, "You are saying that grandmother will definitely make a move against that bastard?" "What bastard?" Ming Qingda's face was full of a warm smile. "That is your seventh uncle. Although he is our enemy right now, he is still your real seventh uncle." Ming Launcher smiled self-mockingly. He suddenly furrowed his brows and asked, "Killing seventh uncle can indeed completely end this matter, but, how will the imperial envoy's side react? No matter how powerful the Juanshan conference is, they can't rebel. Your grandmother is old." Ming Qingda sighed. From the beginning of this matter, the method she used was wrong. Ming Launcher shook his head. Ming Qingda suddenly smiled and said, "However, her mistake does not represent the Ming family's mistake. If your seventh uncle is not so lucky this time, it may not all be a bad thing. Don't worry too much, I know what to do." This ostensible master of the Ming family smiled coldly in his heart. Just let the Juanshan conference, which he could never control, clash with the Overwatch Council. Someone as astute and far-sighted as him naturally had a way to clean up this mess. He just didn't know what method he would use. "Sixth uncle has gotten a good one again this time," Ming Launcher suddenly said mockingly. Ming Qingda lovingly patted his son's shoulder and explained, "Old people always like their youngest son the most, of course, it has to be her own." While the Ming family was in a mess, and at the same time, there were many mice eyeing each other covetously and thinking of trampling each other to death, the youngest son of the Ming family, Ming Qingcheng, the present commander of the Jiangnan Water Bandits, Xia Qifei, the secret inspector of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Jiangnan, was standing on the highest floor of the Jiangnan restaurant in Suzhou. He stood by the side of the building and gently stroked the wooden railing. He gazed thoughtfully at a place outside the city. That place had once been his home, a home he had not returned to for many years, Ming Garden. The gathering of the Jiangnan merchants had already ended. Although no one had set down any specific rules, looking at the greedy eyes of the Lingnan Xiong family and the Quanzhou Sun family, Xia Qifei knew that the commissioner's plan had already worked. Tomorrow, the Ming family would not only have to face his own attack, but they would also have to face attacks similar to the alliance of the Xiong and Sun families. Merchants always had to eat meat. When they were too hungry, who cared whose meat it was? Xia Qifei narrowed his eyes slightly. Ming Garden was too far away. Standing on the tall roof of the Jiangnan restaurant, it was impossible to clearly see the lights in it. Today was the most unrestrained day he had ever lived since he was lucky enough to survive in this world. He finally said his name proudly in front of everyone, Ming Qingcheng. Compared to this, the pleasure of using silver to smash people, leaving his identity as a Jianghu person, and standing on the stage of the Qin kingdom were all not much. As long as he could say his real name, it was like slapping that evil old woman of the Ming family in the face. This pleasure of revenge covered up everything else and made Xia Qifei feel incomparably grateful to Fan Xian. Even when Fan Xian had sent 7 swordsmen, he did not feel a glimmer of unhappiness. He was intoxicated and hurt by everything that had happened today. It was to the point that this ambitious and ruthless person on the Jianghu did not notice that a few strange people had appeared on the opposite street. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 368. Starting today, the monthly votes will be doubled. Canvas votes, canvas votes. Please give me the monthly votes in your hands. Put your palms together and salute. I will also pretend to be an ascetic. Xiaofan left Jiangnan restaurant and stood in front of the main street. Looking at the people passing by in the night, he couldn't resist lowering his head slightly, thinking about something. Big brother. Outside the building, a dozen men surrounded him. They looked at him with a glimmer of respect and unfamiliarity, and bowed respectfully. These people were all good hands of the Jiangnan water bandits. Because of the palace treasury bidding, they had followed Xiaofan into Suzhou. However, Suzhou had always been heavily guarded. Some of these water bandits were even on wanted posters, so normally, they would not enter Suzhou. These people had not expected that they, as bandits, could not only openly wander through Suzhou, but that their leader could even sit at the same table as the wealthiest large merchant families in Jiangnan. Normally, those merchants would only use silver to buy the lives of their brothers to fight. How could they be as polite to Brother Xia as they were today? Thinking of this, a sense of vanity and pride rose in the hearts of these men. The way of the world was indeed different from before. Looking at his subordinates' faces filled with panic and joy, Xiaofan couldn't resist laughing at himself and saying, "Brothers, you all have to learn more. This time, you've also seen those old teachers. When you have free time, ask those teachers for guidance." The teachers in these words were the old officials of the Ministry of Revenue that Imperial Envoy Xiaofan had sent to help him win the bidding. The Jiangnan water bandits were gradually developing in the direction of trading. Xiaofan also hoped that his trusted subordinates could quickly grasp the skills of doing business. At least they had to know how to do accounts. Amidst the joyous and harmonious atmosphere, Xiaofan suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. He raised his head and looked. The bright moon was in the blue dome of the night. It was still spring, so the nights on sunny days were indeed a bit colder. Pulling back his gaze, he saw three strange people standing on the opposite side of the street. The reason why he said these three people were strange was that they had appeared out of nowhere and looked coldly at the street. They were not tourists returning home at night, nor were they guests seeking pleasure after drinking. They were dressed in ordinary clothes, but the person in the middle was wearing a conical hat. On a night like this, he seemed a little special. Having mingled in Jianghu for many years, he had struggled between life and death since he was a child. Xiaofan had no time to react. The chill in his bones and his intuition for danger made a cold light shoot out of his eyes. With a strange cry, the tips of his feet pushed off the ground 3 times, and his entire body floated toward the door of the Jiangnan restaurant. When the tip of his foot touched the ground, the person in the middle of the 3 people across the street placed his hand under the bamboo hat on his shoulder, grasping something. Then, a snow-like blade light sprinkled down, chasing after Xiaofan's body that was treading on the water like a water bird, chopping down. Kill. When the blade light flashed, the Jiangnan water bandits also reacted. Relying on the bravery in their bones, they wanted to stand between their big brother and the soul-chasing blade light. However, their reactions could never catch up to the blade light of the man in the bamboo hat. Only the trusted aide closest to Xiaofan let out a wild roar and pulled out the straight knife hidden in his clothes. He channeled his strength through his arms and used all his strength to block. With a crisp crack, the straight knife in the hands of the water bandits was like a tender lotus root in Jiangnan. It was cut in half by the blade light. With a loud crash, the man's body was split into 2 by that extremely violent saber strike, turning into 2 pieces of horrifying flesh and blood. Blood spurted out, and internal organs spilled all over the ground. The 2 hands that had already been separated were still holding the hilt and the tip of the saber, powerlessly and miserably defending themselves. The power of the blade did not stop. In the quiet night, it had already reached the front of the Jiangnan restaurant, in front of Xiaofan, whose toes had just touched the ground. The energy of the blade was like a straight line, cutting people when it met people, cutting the ground when it met ground. With a swish, it broke through the green stones on the street, revealing the fresh stone stubble within. With a loud boom, rocks flew in front of the Jiangnan restaurant, and dust rose. With a roar, Xia Qifei's two palms came together to meet the indomitable power of the blade. The blade light suddenly faded, and the dust gradually settled. Two streaks of blood spurted from Xia Qifei's nostrils. His hands trembled in front of his body, and he looked with terror at the man in the bamboo hat on the opposite street. This wild blade had come across a long street, cut through a person's body, and caused him internal injury. What kind of terrifying realm was this? He was probably already a 9th-level master. How could there be such an unfamiliar top master in Jiangnan? The wild and unreasonable blade cut through the night sky. After a moment of silence, everyone finally saw the man in the bamboo hat. The man in the bamboo hat was tall, and his entire body exuded a stern and cautious aura. He held a long blade in his hand. The blade was as bright as snow, and the hilt was extremely long. It was a long blade that could only be seen on stage or on the battlefield. This blade was 8 feet long, and no one knew how he had managed to hide it behind his back earlier. All of this happened in the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint. After Xia Qifei desperately blocked this blade, he blinked. In the blink of an eye, he discovered that the situation was somewhat terrifying, because the two people beside the man in the bamboo hat had disappeared without a trace. He didn't know where they had gone. Since the opponent had come to kill him, the two of them would definitely not sit idly by. In reality, just as the man in the bamboo hat pulled out the long blade on his back and valiantly chopped down across the street, the other two aces beside him had already floated up, avoiding the group of Jiangnan water bandits in the middle of the street. Their bodies were like flying swallows, forming two beautiful arcs. Like two dark arrowheads, they pierced toward Xia Qifei's location. Using the long blade as a mountain of thunder, concealing the combined attack of two swallows flying at the same time, if nothing unexpected happened, the panic-stricken Xia Qifei should have already died in that moment. The reason he did not die was because when Xia Qifei barely managed to block that blade, a new change had already occurred on the long street. When the Jiangnan water bandits moved in front of Xia Qifei to block him, there were 4 people in this group of men who very strangely moved to the sides. Then, when the two aces who swept past like swallows wanted to dodge to the sides, these 4 people flipped their palms and pulled out metal drills from under their long robes, stabbing them horizontally. It was a very clean, simple, and neat stab, but it just so happened to land on the chests and abdomens of the two aces. They had no choice but to dodge. These 4 people were the assassins of the 6th Bureau that Fan Xian had hurriedly sent over tonight. Perhaps the skill of the 6th Bureau assassins was not as good as the 3 aces who had come to kill tonight, but their judgment of the current situation and the possible routes that the other party would choose to kill had a natural sensitivity. Thus, they blocked the 2 swallows that the other party had intended to kill together. Ding, 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 ding. In an instant, countless light and crisp sounds rang out on the street in front of the Jiangnan restaurant. They were densely packed, as if they would never stop. It was as if a storm of hail had suddenly descended on the bright and beautiful city of Suzhou in spring. 2 swallow-like aces held 2 short swords in their hands. There was poison on them, and they glowed in the darkness. The 4 6th Bureau assassin swordsmen held iron rods in their hands. They were also poisoned and blended into the darkness. A moment later, a number of muffled grunts seemed to ring out at the same time. The 2 aces who had come to kill Xia Qifei dejectedly swept back across the street. There were a dozen cuts on their clothes from the metal rods. Some of the cuts were deep and seemed to have broken through their skin. On the 6th Bureau's side, they had also paid a heavy price for this. One person's left hand had been neatly sliced off, revealing the bone inside. Another person's shoulder had been stabbed with a knife. A strange color began to appear in the fresh blood, and one person had already fallen into a pool of blood. The two sides had just met face to face, and both sides had suffered irreparable losses. No one knew what kind of danger there had been in those tinkling sounds. Even after suffering such heavy injuries, the 6th Bureau assassins only let out 2 muffled grunts at most. Their willpower and determination were not something normal Jianghu people could compare to. The 3 people who could still move ate the antidote pills made by the 3rd Bureau as they tried to retreat and shrink the defensive circle. They had to protect Xia Qifei's life. The 2 swallows who had retreated across the street did not seem to have thought that there would be such a group of professional assassins by Xia Qifei's side, and that they had also suffered significant injuries. The 2 of them looked at each other and knew that the other side was definitely someone from the Overwatch Council. No matter which faction, they all knew the terrifying extent of the Overwatch Council's poison. Not everyone could withstand the poison that Sir Fei Jie single-handedly took care of. Thus, the 2 of them cleanly turned around and rose. The tips of their feet pushed off the wall and swept into the night sky, immediately disappearing. They were all true aces and assassins of the Jiangnan martial world. Today, they had been entrusted with the task of killing Xia Qifei, but they could not bear to bury their precious lives here. In the distance, a light sound came from the dark alley. 2 of the 3 masters on the opposite side of the street had left, but Xia Qifei felt that his situation hadn't improved at all. In fact, the pressure he was under was even greater, because that long saber, the long saber that could only be seen on the stage, had already charged at him again when the 2 sides were fighting intensely. Before the knife, there was not a single enemy. Under the knife, there would not be a complete corpse. Like splashing snow, the knife light dismembered, separated, and beheaded the brave and respectable water bandits, creating a path of blood. Amidst the sky full of flying limbs, it came closer and closer to Xia Qifei. Seeing his brothers die wretchedly on the long street, hearing the soul-shaking sounds of knives and wretched cries, smelling the thick scent of blood, and seeing the man in the bamboo hat step through the blood, the man walked with such determination and stubbornness, like a demon. Xia Qifei's heart went cold, but his blood heated up. His eyes were about to burst, and he was filled with the desire to charge forward, stand in front of his brothers, and engage in a vigorous battle with this expert in the bamboo hat. Even if he died under the blade, so what? However, he could not move. Instead, he retreated. Sorrowfully but determinedly, he fled toward Jiangnan Restaurant. He knew that the other party's goal was to kill him. His name, this person, was very useful. If he wanted revenge, if he wanted to make the enemy unable to eat or sleep in peace, he had to live. Even if he had to live in such humiliation. The man in the bamboo hat was only 5 steps away from Xia Qifei. The 3 injured swordsmen of the 6th Bureau finally returned to their positions, but their injured bodies could not stand against the ace in the bamboo hat's shocking knife power. The metal rod broke into several pieces, and the 3 of them were sent flying. Jiangnan Restaurant was right in front of him. Xia Qifei fled up the steps. The waiters and customers at the door screamed in panic, but it was as if they were possessed. They were shocked by this bloody and terrifying scene. Their legs weakened, and it seemed they could not move. The ace in the bamboo hat was still 5 steps away from the stone steps when his knife chopped down. The direction of the knife was aimed at the wretched-looking Xia Qifei's back. A customer who seemed to have been scared out of his wits was currently trembling against the beautiful pillars of Jiangnan Restaurant. Then, for some reason, he shook out a metal drill and viciously stabbed it at the thigh of the expert wearing the bamboo hat. The ace with the bamboo hat was tall and powerful. This hidden assassin of the 6th Bureau did not have the confidence to attack the enemy's vital point before he could cut through Xia Qifei's body. Thus, he chose to stab the base of his thigh. No one expected that the ace in the bamboo hat would act as if he did not see this stab. The knife continued to chop down. With a clang, the metal rod struck the base of the man's thigh, but it was like stabbing a metal plate. The Sixth Bureau assassin's heart chilled. He knew that this was the stupid martial art that no one on the Jianghu practiced anymore, iron shirt. Since the other party had practiced it and did not avoid it, it meant that he had stupidly spent decades practicing it, abandoned all the pleasures of a man and a woman, and practiced this martial art to the extreme. This Sixth Bureau assassin knew he could not block this knife, but the commissioner had given a strict order to protect Xia Qifei's life. Thus, he flew sideways and fearlessly jumped toward the ace in the bamboo hat. In midair, he had already pulled out a small dagger from his boot and viciously stabbed it toward the eyes that were covered by the bamboo hat. At this moment, the ace's knife was less than a foot from Xia Qifei's back. The two metal rods once again appeared, tirelessly. There were a total of 7 Sixth Bureau swordsmen that Fan Xian had sent to protect Xia Qifei. Earlier, 5 had already appeared. The last 2 had originally been prepared to be like the leader earlier and attack the enemy's vital point to save Xia Qifei's life. However, after discovering the other party's abnormal martial arts, they knew that method would not work. Furthermore, the knife had already arrived, so they could only helplessly meet the other party's blow head-on. 2 very unpleasant snaps rang out. The 2 metal rods did not break, but they were shaken out of their hands. Xia Qifei took advantage of this block and threw himself forward like a pitiful puppy, narrowly dodging the knife. The knife light landed and cut a large hole in the stone steps of Jiangnan restaurant. Xia Qifei gave a cry and spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. He had been locked onto by this ace's aura the entire time. The knife attacked his body, so he was the one with the heaviest internal injuries. He spat out a mouthful of fresh blood, but his expression remained dark and ruthless as he lay on the ground. His right hand shot out from under his left armpit with incredible speed and pulled out the crossbow arrow hidden in his sleeve. This was something the imperial envoy had given him for self-defense. When the crossbow arrow flew, the Sixth Bureau swordsman had already leaped in front of the ace's body. The ace didn't have time to pull back his long knife. His left hand formed a fist and struck out horizontally. With a boom, the swordsman was sent flying. In this way, there was an opening in front of his face. The thin crossbow arrow shot in front of the bamboo hat. The man finally had a trace of a normal reaction. He tilted his head back slightly. It looked like the face was still a weak spot despite his tyrannical martial arts. The arrow flew through the air and, with a whoosh, pierced deeply into the top of the bamboo hat. There was a belt tied under the bamboo hat, so it was not taken away by the crossbow arrow. Thus, the true appearance of this mysterious 9th-level ace was still not revealed to the crowd. A light sound rang out, but it was not crisp. It was like the sound of children playing with firecrackers or the crackling sound of wet firewood burning. The crossbow arrow embedded in the top of the bamboo hat exploded. A streak of fire flashed by. Immediately, a cloud of smoke rose from the ace's head. It looked incomparably strange. Although the modifications of the Third Bureau were still unable to bring out the true power of the gunpowder, and the power of the burning was not strong enough, it still burned the bamboo hat clean in an instant. The ace in the bamboo hat held a long knife in his hand. His feet were unevenly spaced as he stood silently in front of the Jiangnan restaurant. His face was pitch black with terrifying blisters in the middle. His eyes were tightly closed. It was unclear whether he was alive or dead. Suddenly, he opened his eyes, and a glimmer of anger flashed through them. This mysterious ace was still not dead. However, what caused everyone to be indescribably shocked was not the fact that this person had managed to preserve his life under such a heavy blow, because with his strength, it was not so easy to kill him. What shocked Xia Qifei and the Overwatch Council the most was that this ace, who always wore the bamboo hat, was bald. Nowadays, the world was particular about filial piety. It was said that the body, hair, and skin were given to one's parents. No one would randomly cut their hair, much less be bald. The only people in this world who were allowed to walk around with a bald appearance were the ascetic monks. The ascetic monks who believed in the temple. Everyone knew that the ascetic monks loved the people and cherished their bodies. They never had anything to do with the battles of the secular world. Why had this extremely powerful ascetic monk come to kill Xiaofan today? There was no time to think about this shocking question because the ascetic monk once again raised that terrifying long knife. With a muffled grunt, he held the knife with both hands and chopped toward Xiaofan on the steps. His power was like a mad tiger that could not be stopped by 1,000 soldiers. 1,000 soldiers could not be stopped by a single flower. The despairing people on the stone steps only felt a cool breeze sweep past in front of them. A flower-like ocean bloomed in front of their eyes. In a moment, it drove away the smell of blood on the long street in front of the restaurant. Fragrant flowers filled the air and refreshed the mind. A pair of steady and gentle hands, carrying a basket of cheap silk flowers bought from Wuxia, welcomed the sharp edge of the long knife that pressed forward with indomitable will. The knife came very quickly, but the hands were even faster. For some reason, in the next moment, the flower basket was already hanging from the long knife. The knife force was very fierce. The flower basket was very light. When the flower basket gently hung from the tip of the long knife, which had been steady and terrifying, involuntarily trembled and drooped down. It was as if the flower basket was incomparably heavy. The knife force paused. The ascetic monk holding the knife gave an explosive cry. Jinshi surged out of his arms and valiantly lifted it up like he was lifting up Dong Mountain. With a crashing sound, the flower basket finally could not withstand the resistance of the astonishing true energy from both sides. It was pierced by the tip of the saber and fell apart. The flower basket that was woven from the vines was pulled out bit by bit in that moment that seemed to have come to a standstill. The vines shattered and turned into countless fragments that shot out and hit the ground with a pa-pa sound. The silk flowers in the basket were stirred up by the wind and fluttered into the air, decorating the long street like an azure battlefield. Amidst the rain of flower petals, the girl wearing a flowery cotton jacket was like a gust of wind. Following the trembling long knife, she gently attacked the ascetic monk. The ascetic monk struck out with his palm. The wind from his palm was like a knife, but it could not stop the other party's swaying figure. A moment later, the pair of gentle hands gently patted the hilt of the knife. Then, with a flick of her fingers, it pierced straight toward the edge of the ascetic monk's huge palm. The ascetic monk gave a strange cry. A strange red color formed from the Jinshi surging appeared on his burned face. His entire body retreated like a large bird. In one exchange, this killing godlike ascetic monk had been forced back. The rain of flower petals was still falling. Contrasted with the blue night and bright moon above Suzhou, it appeared particularly beautiful. Flower petals fell one after another. Haitang stood calmly in the rain of flower petals. She did not pursue. She only looked at the ascetic monk with a trace of worry. Village girls occasionally had their most beautiful moments. Second priest of the Qing temple, why are you here? Haitang asked with a face full of worry. The ascetic monk looked at her and recognized her identity. In a stern voice, he cried out, Haitang duo. Why are you here? Haitang lowered her head slightly and quietly said, I'm with Fan Xian. The ascetic monk was startled. It was as if he had not thought that Haitang, the successor of Tian Yi Dao and Northern Qi's saint girl, would give such a reason so easily. Today, I want to kill. Don't stop me, the ascetic monk looked at her and said coldly. Haitang furrowed her brows slightly. She looked at the stone steps of Jiangnan restaurant, the dead people in the middle of the long street, the broken limbs, and the pungent blood. In a quiet voice, she said, You've already killed enough people tonight. Don't kill anymore. It was not a request or a persuasion. Since Fan Xian was worried about Xia Qifei's side and had come up with the idea to have Haitang come take a look, it represented his absolute trust in Haitang. With Haitang here, other than the legendary 4 old immortals, as long as she said not to kill, no one else could kill. Although the ascetic monk had been badly burned, it was still possible to see a glimmer of determination on his face. He glanced at Haitang with a strange gaze and then turned to leave. He didn't need a path to leave. The ascetic monk directly smashed through a courtyard wall on the side of the street. With a rumble, a large hole appeared in the wall. His figure disappeared into this hole. The sky full of flower petals fell. Haitang was silent. Then, her body floated lightly and she arrived behind the courtyard wall. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 369. I started running a fever yesterday and my mind is a bit muddled. I will continue to lie down in a bit. If my body improves slowly, perhaps I will write less tomorrow. Haitang swept into the courtyard beside the street and gently stroked the strands of hair at her temples. She looked at the ascetic monk who had indeed not left. Those who could live on the 2 sides of the street were naturally wealthy and respectable. After the intrusion, the owner of the house had long woken up and hid far away, not daring to light a lamp. At this moment, the light from the restaurant across the street shone through the large hole in the wall and into the courtyard. It also shone on this person's face, which appeared particularly terrifying after his injury. Haitang looked at him and asked with slight worry, "Why is it like this?" The ascetic monk only looked at her calmly and did not reply. Haitang was not in a hurry, although the faint sound of the Suzhou government officials moving their chains could already be heard in the distance. There were not many ascetic monks in this world. The ascetic monks, led by the great priest of the Qing temple, always preached in various places. These ascetic monks silently recited the wondrous meaning of scriptures and did good deeds. They had never been a power known for their martial strength. However, during these decades, the Qing temple had produced an anomaly, Great Master Sanshi. He was born with divine strength and had cultivated his internal and external martial arts to the peak. Additionally, his personality was ruthless and he hated evil like an enemy. However, because of his identity as a priest, very few people had seen him fight. Few people knew his true face and power. Of course, this was also because the previous great priest of the Qing temple had always used scriptures to advise him and watched him closely. Otherwise, this great master Sanshi would have long become the most famous figure in the world. After all, the Qing temple and northern Qi's Tianyi Dao were both places where the temple was worshipped and could be considered to be of the same lineage. Thus, Haitang had seen him once in the past. She knew that the ascetic monk in front of her, the second priest of the Qing temple, the legendary great master Sanshi, was a noble figure purely in terms of status. In terms of temperament and cultivation, he was not a bloodthirsty person. Thus, what she did not understand was why the priest, who had never involved himself in worldly affairs, would join the palace treasury or the struggle of the court. Juanshan Conference, just what kind of organization is it? Haitang said with a slight frown, as if she was talking to herself. The second priest looked coldly at her and said, "Don't waste your time thinking about these problems." Yes, I am a member of the Juanshan Conference. The Juanshan Conference has always been a loose association. Perhaps this organization never had a specific goal. Once everyone found a certain goal, they would advance together towards that goal. Haitang asked softly, "Then what is your goal?" "Kill Xia Qifei." The second priest said coldly. Haitang smiled and said, "It's just a dispute between merchants. How could it attract your attention?" She calmly asked, Xia Qifei has already won a bid in the palace treasury. You chose to kill him in the middle of the street. Are you not afraid of the anger of the Qing court? The second priest said expressionlessly, killing Xia Qifei is only to return the palace treasury matter to the path we want. Haitang was slightly taken aback and said in great confusion, these words are not enough to convince me. I understand you and the high priest. You are not a person who covets fame and wealth. The second priest fell silent. Haitang then said in a quiet voice, the Ming family also does not have the right to invite you. The second priest slowly raised his head. As I said earlier, this is a loose collaboration. However, my goal and the Ming family's goal just happen to be the same. You want to deal with Fan Xian? Haitang's brows furrowed. The second priest shook his head coldly. Haitang sighed in her heart. She guessed the truth of the matter. The other person's identity was special. Since he could not be ordered by anyone, yet he wanted to interfere in the palace treasury bidding matter, it must be because of the problems in Jingdo. Since the second priest's goal was not Fan Xian, then the source of the matter was about to be revealed. Haitang shook her head and said, it is truly hard to believe that a priest of the Qing temple would secretly oppose the Qing emperor. Countless blisters had appeared on the second priest's face. There were threads of blood in the black ash. It looked terrifying. The pupils of his eyes turned white. Faintly, he said, the saint girl is clever. The imperial envoy has come under the emperor's order to rectify the palace treasury. What I am thinking is to make this so-called emperor's order forever unable to be carried out. Haitang was silent. It looked like an undercurrent had already begun to appear within the Qing court. The direction of the undercurrent was directed toward the man sitting on the dragon chair. As the man's most favored and trusted official, Fan Xian would stand at the forefront and face great danger if nothing unexpected happened. The reason the second priest was willing to reveal so many secrets in front of Haitang was because of Haitang's identity as a northern Qi person and the closeness between the Qing temple and Tianyi Dao. The second priest knew that no matter how close Haitang was to Fan Xian, as a northern Qi person, knowing that someone within the Qing kingdom was preparing to harm the emperor, he would maintain a clever silence. Haitang was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, Master, it is not wise to ask a tiger for its skin. The loose Juanshang conference had to walk closer together because of that terrifying reason. For such a major matter, there had to be someone taking the lead. Based on Haitang's analysis, the leader was perhaps the eldest princess who had never shown much power but had made Fan Xian carefully guard against. The second priest coldly said, in the eyes of a flower, the worm is the tiger. In the eyes of a bamboo, the fire is the tiger. In the eyes of a river, the sun is the tiger. In my eyes, the emperor is the tiger. Haitang furrowed her brows and asked, what exactly happened? What kind of matter would make the second priest of the Qing temple so resolutely throw himself into this messy world? What made the ascetic monk, who had always been merciful and pitiful to the people, become a demonic Asura who beheaded people? A glimmer of sadness and reminiscence flashed through the second priest's terrifying eyes. A moment later, he gently said, Senior disciple has passed away. Haitang was slightly startled. The news of the Qing temple's great priest's death had already spread throughout the world a few months ago. At the time, the Qing court had issued an edict saying that the great priest had been preaching in the south for many years and had entered a foul miasma for a long time. He had become ill from overwork, so not long after returning to the capital, he had died in bed. Hearing the second priest say this, Haitang understood that the inside story was certainly not so simple. Perhaps the death of the great priest of the Qing temple had much to do with the Qing emperor. She put her hands together and bowed. She knew she couldn't continue asking this question. He had already given her enough hints and wouldn't say anything more. Earlier, why didn't you stop me from revealing your identity? Haitang asked silently. Killing people on the street today, were you not worried that you would inadvertently alert the enemy and that the Qing emperor would notice some clues? The second priest of the Qing temple expressionlessly raised 3 fingers. There are 3 stones in the mountain. One is bright, one is upright, and one is abandoned. From a young age, Sancher was different from normal people. He was chased into the wilderness by the villagers. If not for my senior disciple, he would have long been buried in the bellies of wild dogs. The second priest of the Qing temple's voice was like a large bell. His beard and hair floated in the wind. He was powerful without being angry. The people of the world have taken my senior disciple's life. I will disturb the hearts of the world. I will use bright skills to kill people, use a righteous voice to deceive people, and use my body as an abandoned pawn to kill a chaotic ruler and bring peace to the people. Haitang understood the first 2 meanings of these words, but she didn't understand the last one. However, countless complicated emotions still surged in her heart. Although there were already signs of division within the Qing court, looking at the Qing emperor's powerful control over the governors of the 7 roads and the military, she knew that there were no fundamental problems with the Qing kingdom's rule. Sancher killing people on the street tonight was nothing more than using bright skills and righteous voice to announce to the world that the priests of the Qing temple and the court were no longer companions on the same path. Although the second priest was not enough to represent the entire Qing temple and all the believers and ascetic monks under heaven, this kind of declaration still had a powerful symbolic meaning. As for the last word, abandon, Haitang finally understood. Great Master Sancher also knew that the instigator behind the scenes of the Juanshan conference was not much better than the Qing emperor. His actions today were, for one, to kill Xia Qifei and destroy the Qing emperor's grand policy. For another, it was resolutely abandoning her. Perhaps this second priest didn't even know what he should be doing. After losing the great priest's teachings and restrictions, Sancher had no way of killing the emperor. Furthermore, the priests of the Qing temple did not want the people of the world to suffer for the sake of revenge. For Sancher, the people of the Jiangnan water bandits were blood-stained bandits. If they were killed, then they were killed. There was not a trace of pity in his heart. However, the powerful desire for revenge in his heart, his judgment of the situation, and his worry for the people of the world made this Sancher sink into a mental conflict. Thus, he told Haitang these things. At the same time, he told her that he was willing to be a sacrificial pawn. I will return to Jingdo to kill people and tell Imperial Advisor Ku He what I said today. Sancher was silent and melancholy at odds with his magnificent figure. He turned and left the courtyard, which already had a large hole in it. Haitang stood quietly without any movement. She thought to herself that the second priest of the Qing temple had so easily abandoned her, but the Juanshan conference would certainly have follow-up actions. She didn't know if they would target Fan Xian far away in Jiangnan or the Qing emperor sitting peacefully in Jingdo. It looked like there were many people in this world who didn't want the Qing emperor to live comfortably. How should the Qi kingdom respond? Sancher? A sacrificial pawn? Fan Xian looked at Haitang with a not-quite-there smile, but a dark fire danced in his eyes. I don't understand the enigmatic conversation between you people. I only know that if he truly wanted to abandon himself, he should have charged directly into the front gates of the royal palace and fought a great battle with the great prince's imperial soldiers and eunuch Hong in the palace instead of running into Suzhou and ruining my plans. To kill my people. The last 2 sentences were spoken in a higher voice. His tone was very severe. As for the word abandon, Haitang gazed at him calmly and said, the Juanshan conference certainly doesn't want the second priest to reveal his identity so early. If I hadn't been there today, probably no one would have had the opportunity to reveal this secret. The meaning behind these words was clear. The enemy's calculations had gone wrong. The second priest had failed to kill, so he might as well give up. He laid out all the problems in front of Haitang and used himself to attract the Qing emperor's attention while hiding the other existences of the Juanshan conference. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "This second priest thinks too highly of himself. Perhaps the emperor has nothing, but his confidence, which I don't know where it comes from, is stronger than everyone else's. If I were you, how could I bear to let that baldy leave so peacefully? He only said a few simple words and convinced you to ignore it. It looks like this second priest truly has the ability to be a lobbyist." These words appeared normal, but they actually contained a criticism. In his anger, Fan Xian straightforwardly expressed that there was a portion of the conversation between the second priest and Haitang that Haitang had not directly said. After all, this was internal Qing politics. As a northern Qi person, no one could say for sure what Haitang would do for the benefit of her own country. Haitang was not angry. She explained in a quiet voice, "The Juanshan conference will certainly protect the Ming family, and the old matriarch also fell for your provocation. She invited someone to kill Xia Qifei. Isn't this all within your expectations? Why are you still so angry?" Fan Xian paused. He had not expected that Haitang would so mercilessly reveal all of her sinister thoughts. He furrowed his brows and said, "Correct, I wanted to force the Ming family to act. However, I had not thought that the Ming family would be able to invite such an ace. It looks like I still underestimated the so-called Juanshan conference. Tonight, there were heavy casualties in front of Jiangnan restaurant. About 80 to 90% of the Jiangnan water bandits that Xia Qifei had brought into Suzhou had been killed by that sharp knife. In order to protect Xia Qifei's life, the Overwatch Council had paid a heavy price. One of the 7 assassins of the 6th Bureau had died. At this moment, there were still 4 people unconscious. No one knew if they would survive. Ever since Fan Xian had taken over the Overwatch Council, this was the Overwatch Council's biggest loss. He couldn't help but blame himself and be angry. Everything had clearly been within his calculations. Unfortunately, because he had underestimated the other party's strength, it had led to this situation. What made Fan Xian most angry was, in the plan, once the Ming family was forced to act, he could use the opportunity to attack. However, all of this had been destroyed by Haitang's cry on Chang Street. The second priest? At most, the second priest of the Qing temple would have dealings with the royal family. If Fan Xian wanted to use this matter to investigate the Ming family, it was impossible. Even if he used the Overwatch Council's most sinister and dirty methods to frame them, it would be impossible to convince the court and the officials in Jingdou. No one believed that a wealthy Jiangnan Ming family could order the second priest of the Qing temple to act as an assassin. This reality made Fan Xian feel an absurd sense of defeat. In the past, when he faced enemies, even if it was not the other party who did it, he could still frame them and make them admit it. Now, it was clearly the other party who did it. If he openly investigated it, no one would believe him. He shook his head helplessly and waved his hand. Duo, go to sleep first. I was in a bad mood earlier, so my words were a bit harsh. Don't take it to heart." Haitang glanced at him with some surprise and furrowed her brows. "Tonight?" Fan Xian took a deep breath and forcefully suppressed the burning feeling in his heart. A warm smile rose again to his face. In a quiet voice, he said, "It's very late. If there's anything else, we'll talk about it tomorrow." For tonight, Fan Xian had prepared for a long time. To suddenly give up at this moment, no one knew what he was thinking. Haitang left the study somewhat sullenly. Fan Xian sat quietly in front of the desk and thought for a bit. He then began to raise his brush and write on a piece of paper. He had to report what happened tonight to the emperor in Jingdou. In reality, he did not think that the appearance of the second priest was anything remarkable. As an official, even if he also harbored evil intentions, he had to display an attitude of concern and fear at the appropriate time. After finishing the secret letter, he couldn't resist picking up the letter beside it. The handwriting on the letter was dry and ugly. It was the handwriting of that old man called Chen Pingping. In the letter, Chen Pingping did not say anything about the court or officialdom. He only told a short story, a story about crows drinking water. He warned Fan Xian, who was not by his side, that no matter what it was, he could not be rushed. The more rushed he was, the less water he would have to drink. Throwing a stone into a bottle? This was a game where if you wanted to take, you had to first give. Fan Xian looked at this letter and furrowed his brows. Today, in the palace treasury courtyard, Ming Qingda had left a deep impression on him. The old Ming master's ability to remain calm in the face of chaos was truly worth learning from. In comparison, the old Ming matriarch, who had been successfully stirred up by him and had secretly notified the Juanshan conference to kill people on the street, did not seem to be much of a problem. However, the old matriarch was still in power in the Ming family. This reality made Fan Xian's heart relax a little. The person who had acted was the second priest. This matter had many implications, so it was not suitable to act immediately. Fan Xian thought for a bit and decided to push the date back a few days. Xia Qifei was lucky and did not die. Tomorrow, the palace treasury bidding still had to continue. Life also had to go on, and the days also had to go on. After everything had calmed down, when the stone had reached the bottleneck, he would begin to drink water. Going out, he said as he accepted a large cloak from Cici's hands. Cici looked at him in astonishment, thinking that it was almost midnight. Where were they going to go? However, she knew that the young master was in a hurry to go out at this time. Something big must have happened, so she didn't ask further. Fan Xian put on the crane cloak and hurried toward the front door of Ming Garden. As he walked, he said to the subordinate beside him, "This matter has gotten out of hand. Immediately send out a first-level council order. Increase the search for the second priest's whereabouts in the southeast." The subordinate furrowed his brows and replied, "Sir, the Qing temple has always been managed by the palace. Let's also interfere." Fan Xian was slightly angry and scolded, "He's already come to kill us, why can't I kill him?" The subordinate quickly shut his mouth and gave the order. In reality, Fan Xian's words also had other intentions. Haitang had said earlier that the second priest looked like he was preparing to go to Jingdo and assassinate Jing Ku, yet Fan Xian had the Overwatch Council search the southeast. The shadow was not in Suzhou, and the Overwatch Council's current manpower could not keep Great Master Sanshi. Fan Xian's actions were nothing more than a gesture. First, it prevented his subordinates from meeting this ace again and suffering heavy losses. Second, it allowed the second priest to enter the capital. Clearly, the second priest had entered the capital to play dragon slaying, yet Fan Xian had made such arrangements. No one knew what he was thinking. Walking to the front door, Tiger Guard Gouda helped him lift the curtain. Fan Xian had one foot on the carriage and stopped. He seemed to be thinking about something. A moment later, he turned around and said, "Call back all of the people standing outside tonight." The Overwatch Council official was slightly startled. He wondered if tonight's plan had been cancelled. Given his understanding of the commissioner, if his subordinate suffered a loss, he would immediately retaliate. Had the commissioner suddenly changed his personality? Ignoring his subordinate's shock, Fan Xian crawled into the carriage. The wheels of the carriage rolled across the stone path of Suzhou and made a clattering sound. At this time, it was already late into the night. There were no pedestrians on the streets. There were only the Suzhou government bailiffs who had learned of what had happened. They glanced around with sleepy eyes. However, they were fine. At least, they were more relaxed than the brothers in front of Jiangnan restaurant. It was said that the brothers there were carrying corpses and picking up severed limbs. A few of them had already vomited in disgust. Fan Xian half leaned against the back of the chair and gently pinched between his brows with both hands. He forcefully pushed away the tiredness in his mind and the powerful urge to jump out and kill at any moment. He allowed the carriage to take him along the quiet Suzhou night streets. Beside the carriage were a few tiger guards. Xia Qifei had been attacked, so Fan Xian's security had been increased. Before long, the carriage came to the side door of the Jiangnan governor's manor. There was no time to hand over any name cards. Fan Xian straightforwardly used his face as a pass and burrowed all the way into the manor. Under the confused escort of the manor's housekeeper and servants, he came directly to the flower hall in the back garden that the manor used for receiving secret guests. He hadn't even taken 2 sips of tea when the Jiangnan governor Xueqing, who the housekeeper said had long fallen asleep, rushed over. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at Xueqing's attire. After a moment of surprise, he smiled. The governor's clothes were neat and tidy. It didn't look like he had just been woken up by him. It looked like the officials in Suzhou would not be able to sleep well tonight. Xueqing saw him smile and couldn't resist smiling as well. He waved his hand to have everyone leave. He took a sip of tea and moistened his throat. Straightforwardly, he asked, "Imperial envoy, what business do you have to come in the middle of the night?" Fan Xian's answer was even more direct. He raised a finger and said, "Tonight, someone wants to kill my people, so I am preparing to kill." The Jiangnan governor was slightly startled and sank into silence. Of course, he knew what had happened in Suzhou tonight. He had also expected that Fan Xian, who had always been sinister and protective, would certainly act against the Ming family. However, he had not thought that the other party would come to inform him beforehand. This kind of attitude made Xueqing feel a glimmer of comfort. Xueqing thought for a moment and then said evenly, "I can understand the imperial envoy's current feelings." These words were as good as not saying anything. Understanding did not mean support. Fan Xian also understood this point. After all, the Ming family was a prominent family in Jiangnan. There were tens of thousands of children in the family. Their support in court was even more so. The Ming family's hands and feet had long been deeply embedded into the lives of the Jiangnan people. If Fan Xian wanted to use the martial power of the Overwatch Council to carry out simple and crude oppression of the Ming family, it would certainly cause countless reprisals. The situation in Jiangnan might become turbulent because of this. Jiangnan could not fall into chaos. Once it did, as the Jiangnan governor, Xueqing would be the first to bear the brunt. He would not be able to explain himself to the court and the emperor. Thus, in front of Fan Xian, he could only say he understood and not say anything else. For Fan Xian, the Black Knights were still in Jiangbei. Unless it was the last step, he would not risk the emperor's suspicions and the officials' uproar to move troops into Suzhou. Thus, at this moment, the power he could use was actually not much. To deal with a character like the Ming family, he needed the Jiangnan governor, Xueqing's help, or at least his tacit approval. This was why he had rushed through the night to the governor's manor. Knowing what Xueqing was worried about, Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "Governor, don't worry. Although I am somewhat bold and unrestrained, when I do things, I will follow the rules." Xueqing's heart was slightly at ease. He was not a person on the eldest princess's side, so he was willing to stay out of the battle between the Overwatch Council and the prince. Tonight, the Ming family had sent someone to assassinate the bidding merchant in front of the Jiangnan restaurant. Although everyone knew that the merchant was actually a water bandit, this reality still made this border official feel angry. To be a merchant, one had to have their duties and boundaries. Tonight, the Ming family had crossed the line. Furthermore, the Jiangnan restaurant where the assassination took place was the governor's property. Before the palace treasury's 16 bids have all been decided, I will not act. Fan Xian gazed into Xueqing's eyes and said evenly, "After the day after tomorrow, I will have the Ming family pay the price for this matter. Just let them learn a lesson. Xue Qing sighed like an ascetic monk who bemoaned the state of the universe and pitied the fate of mankind. Fan Xian smiled slightly. He knew that this governor still did not want the matter to become too big. Furthermore, he did not have the extravagant hope that he would be able to knock away a large family that had lasted for hundreds of years within a few days. He said, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. Evidence, the most important thing is evidence." Xue Qing looked at the young imperial envoy in front of him and couldn't resist opening his mouth to remind him. This matter was not a simple battle between officials and merchants. It was a battle between the powers of the court. If they could not obtain evidence and wanted to cut the Ming family's flesh and blood, it would be very easy for some people in Jingdo to grab hold of Fan Xian's weakness. In life, there is never a lack of evidence, Fan Xian said calmly. It is just a lack of eyes to discover evidence. The Overwatch Council's eyes are very bright. These two most powerful officials in Jiangnan talked in secret for a long time. When the two of them could not hide their weariness, only then did Fan Xian take his leave. The situation in Jiangnan was becoming more and more murky. It was like the darkness before dawn. At a glance, one could only see the bottom of the pitch-black abyss. Fan Xian leaned against the back of the carriage seat and fell into a deep sleep. He was completely unaware that the sky outside the carriage was gradually brightening. There were no bells or drums in the morning in Suzhou, but the dawn of spring had already arrived. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 370. The second priest cannot have his hair and beard float. This is my mistake. These days, I have indeed been a bit muddle-headed. Please forgive me. P.S. I still need a monthly ticket. Please don't find it annoying. Although many people did not sleep well that night, many people were busy, and some people did not sleep at all. Furthermore, such a big thing had happened in Suzhou. However, the second day of the palace treasury's New Year bidding still arrived as scheduled. This was the rule. This was the usual rule of the court. Thus, even though eunuch Huang and Guozheng used Suzhou's tight security and Xia Qifei's assassination attempt as an excuse to ask the transport company to push back the bidding by a few days, Fan Xian still resolutely and valiantly demanded that the bidding begin on time and not be delayed for even a moment. The Ming family had already fought for one night's time. If they were given more time to react, who knew what else would happen? Fan Xian rubbed the sore spot between his brows and forcefully hid the tiredness on his face. He watched the merchants file in. He found that although the expressions of these Jiangnan merchants remained calm, there was still a strange emotion hidden in their eyes. It looked like the matter of Xia Qifei's assassination attempt last night had also brought them great trouble. Fan Xian was temporarily unable to determine whether this change was good or bad for his plan. The Ming father and son were the second to last group of people to enter the palace treasury courtyard. Behind them were the long attendants of the clan and the accounts master. With warm expressions, they bowed in all directions. The officials and merchants only gave a perfunctory greeting before moving their gazes away. No one dared to appear too close to the Ming family in front of Fan Xian. When the Ming father and son bowed in front of the main hall, eunuch Huang and Guozheng greeted them warmly. It was clear they were expressing their support for each other. Fan Xian watched with cold eyes and nodded with a smile. He then waved his hand for them to sit. Ming Qingda's gaze was very strange. He appeared very calm. It looked like for some reason, he was not afraid of Fan Xian's revenge for the assassination attempt on Xia Qifei last night. Before the main door closed, the Jiangnan water bandits also arrived. Behind Xia Qifei, other than the few old officials of the Ministry of Revenue that Fan Xian had sent, there were only 3 personal guards left. His other brothers had already died on the long street last night. Today, Xia Qifei's face was deathly pale. It seemed that there was no way for him to recover from his serious injuries. However, today's matter was of great importance, so he forced himself to come. Compared to the bandages on his body, the white bandage on his forehead was particularly dazzling and bright. The subordinates behind him also wore white bandages on their foreheads. In this spring, they exuded an icy chill. It was the first time in decades that a mourner had entered the door of the palace treasury. Everyone in the house had their eyes on the bandits from room B4, who were wearing mourning clothes and had a murderous aura around them. The merchants led by the Xiong family of Lingnan and the Sun family of Chuanzhou walked out of their rooms and greeted Xia Qifei, comforting him softly. Supported by his subordinates, Xia Qifei slowly walked to the front of the main hall. He didn't even glance at the father and son of the Ming family in the first room. In a quiet voice, he said, "I still came." Eunuch Hong and Guozheng had a strange expression on their faces. The corner of Fan Xian's eye twitched and immediately returned to normal. Calmly, he spread out his right hand and said steadily and firmly, "As long as you come, there will be a place for you here." Everyone understood the meaning of Fan Xian's words. Eunuch Huang and Guozheng could not use these words to criticize Fan Xian. The Jiangnan governor, Xueqing, had said he was sick and did not come. Presently, in the large house, Fan Xian's position was the highest. It was clear that Xueqing was letting Fan Xian do as he wished. However, the Ming family's backers would not watch as the entire situation was in Fan Xian's control. Eunuch Huang paused for a moment and then said, "Sir Xia, I heard that the Jianghu fighting broke out again last night in Suzhou. Many of your subordinates have died, however, entering the courtyard in mourning is not proper. After all, Xia Qifei's birth was not honorable. That was why the old matriarch of the Ming family dared to invite the aces of the Juanshan conference to carry out the assassination. After all, if they could kill Xia Qifei, it would solve many problems. Furthermore, they could push the blame onto the Jianghu fighting." Eunuch Huang's words right now were nothing more than an attempt to make this point a reality. Fan Xian felt it was beneath him to bicker with him about these nominal things. However, after hearing Eunuch Huang say entering the courtyard in mourning was not proper, his anger gradually rose. Narrowing his eyes, he said in a quiet voice, "Eunuch Huang, don't make me angry." Although these words were spoken lightly, the voice seemed to have scraped out from a crack in an iceberg and scuttled out from the abyss in the ground. It was so cold and sinister that it made those who heard it tremble in fear. "Don't make me angry." These words burrowed into Eunuch Huang's ears and made the old eunuch involuntarily shiver. He quickly closed his mouth. If he didn't want to be angry with this damned sissy youth, then let him go. In any case, the Ming family had already prepared all night. In a moment, as long as he watched, there wouldn't be any problems. If he let Fan Xian use this opportunity to fly into a rage, who could stop him? It would not be good to ruin everything. To the side, Guozheng, who was about to open his mouth, also felt a chill in his heart. He quickly swallowed back the words he was about to say. Last night, they had all thought that Fan Xian would act rashly in his anger. Thus, they had both written memorials and made preparations to grab hold of Fan Xian's weakness. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had maintained his calm the entire time. It made him and Eunuch Huang very disappointed. They also knew that the evil fire in Fan Xian's heart had been suppressed for a long time. They didn't know when it would explode. Thinking of the ministers and officials who had fallen under Fan Xian's hands, Guozheng also retreated. The eldest princess wanted to protect the Ming family's share, not their face. Another explosion rang out. Outside the courtyard of the palace treasury manor, paper flew chaotically, and smoke gradually filled the air. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at this somewhat familiar scene. For some reason, he thought of last year, the day he left Shangjing in northern Qi and the moment he heard the news of Zhuang Mohan's death. On that day, the firecrackers outside Shangjing's gates to send him off seemed to also be sending off Master Zhuang. Were the firecrackers today to send off the people who died last night? Xia Qifei brought his subordinates and walked silently back to room B4. He took off the white ribbon on his head and carefully laid it out on the table in a perfectly straight line. His brothers behind him also followed his eldest brother and took off the white ribbons and laid them out straight. One by one, they were strong and powerful. Fan Xian's brows furrowed imperceptibly. No one knew what he was thinking about. The palace treasury official responsible for announcing once again stood on the stone steps. The palace treasury's second day of bidding officially began. Yesterday, there had been a total of 5 lots. The palace treasury had a total of 16 lots. Other than the last 2 that were tied to 8 lots, there were still 3 lots left to be announced at the very beginning. The Ming family still followed the agreement between the Jiangnan merchants and did not call out a price. On the contrary, it was Xia Qifei who did not seem to be disturbed by the events of last night. Very calmly, he began to bid and took one of the lots. The other 2 were taken by the Lingnan Xiong family and the Hangzhou Chen family. This was probably something that had been discussed at the Jiangnan restaurant last night. The lot that Xia Qifei had taken was still the north route. After Fan Xian received the bid from the flower hall and confirmed that Xia Qifei had taken this lot, he couldn't help but nod his head quietly. Xia Qifei did not let his emotions affect his decisions. This was something he admired. The bidding for these 3 lots proceeded in an ordinary and uneventful manner. The prices were basically the same as in previous years. There was nothing surprising about them. However, none of the merchants and officials present had much of a reaction. Everyone knew that the highlight of the day was at the back. It was in the last 8 lots that the Ming family was determined to win. Goods from the Southeast Road and the Sea Road. 4 lots in total. The bidding begins. The highest bidder wins. The Palace Treasury Transport Company official stood on the stone steps and called out expressionlessly. He didn't know how many years he had been calling out these words. Every year, after these words were called out, only the Ming family would bid. No one would compete with the Ming family. Thus, when he called it out, he felt it was dull and uninteresting. But, this year was different. As the call fell, the first to push open the door and hand out the leather envelope was room B4. Countless voices of discussion rang out in the courtyard. Xia Qifei, the 7th young master rumored to have been abandoned by the Ming family, had finally begun to act against the Ming family. In room A1, Ming Qingda's expression did not change. It was as if he had long expected this situation. In the past few years, because of his family's strength and the eldest princess watching from the back, none of the Jiangnan merchants dared to bid against him. Thus, the Ming family in the last 8 lots was the same as the Cui family in the first 6. They were all playing a one-man show. After playing this kind of show for a long time, one would eventually grow tired of it. Now, someone had finally come to compete with the Ming family. While Ming Qingda felt a slight sense of fear, he also felt a glimmer of excitement. He smiled slightly at his son beside him and said, 20% more, hold him down. Ming Launcher paled in shock. Father meant to say that the first round of bidding would be 20% more than last year's fixed price? If, in a moment, Xia Qifei truly had enough silver in the second round and continued to follow, how could his side hold out? Ming Qingda picked up the teacup beside him and took a sip. Slowly, he said, the extra 20% is not for Xia Qifei, but for someone else. Ming Launcher was confused. He thought to himself, in the palace treasury courtyard, other than Xia Qifei, who had the support of the imperial envoy, who else dared to compete with his family for these two big lots? In the heart of this young master of the Ming family, he still firmly believed that Xia Qifei's confidence came from the silver Fan Xian had secretly moved from the Ministry of Revenue. The other people did not have this kind of power. Ming Qingda didn't say anything, but his heart was as clear as a mirror. Fan Xian had Xia Qifei sweep everywhere yesterday. This was to turn the other Jiangnan merchants into hungry wolves, and a hungry wolf dared to take a bite or two of anyone's meat. When the 2 leather envelopes were handed into the flower hall, all of the merchants and officials paying attention to this matter dropped their buttocks back to their seats and let out a breath of turbid air. They knew a good show had officially begun. However, it seemed that many people did not guess the direction of this show. The door to room B1 was also slowly pushed open. A leather envelope was handed into the hands of the official in front of the door. The Chuanzhou Sun family. The entire courtyard burst into an uproar. No one had thought that the Chuanzhou Sun family would come to snatch this hot cup of soup when 2 tigers were fighting. The Sun family. Ming Launcher looked at his father in shock. Where did their family get so much silver? Ming Qingda's expression did not change. If the Sun family alone is not enough, can't a few families come together? Don't you think that Xiong Beiling, that old thing, has become much quieter today? And those families that have been watching us this whole time, if they don't have something to hide, why would they watch for so long? It's not like there are flowers growing on my face. In the main hall, the officials sitting in the 3 grand chairs all had their own thoughts. Fan Xian had long expected this development, so he was not very surprised. However, Eunuch Huang and Guozheng gritted their teeth. They thought to themselves that the Chuanzhou Sun family was too daring to come out and make trouble at a time like this. Under everyone's nervous gazes, the results of the first round of bidding came out. Fan Xian held the bidding list from the flower hall and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. He thought to himself that it was not without reason that the Ming family had been in Jiangnan for so many years. In Fan Xian's plan, the last 4 lots would be when he and the Ming family would do their utmost to raise the price. Although the amount of silver moved over from northern Qi was large, it required too long of a route. In the end, there was still an upper limit. Furthermore, after Xia Qifei had won 5 lots in a row, he had also paid a large amount of money as a deposit. If he could carry out an unlimited fake bid, Xia Qifei could completely call out an empty bid and make the Ming family cough up blood. The problem was, Fan Xian still did not understand Ming Qingda. This nominal master of the Ming family did not seem to be as simple as in name. Fan Xian was unable to determine whether or not Ming Qingda would disregard the eldest princess' strict orders and cleverly cut off his hand if he truly carried out a fake bid. Given the amount of silver in Fan Xian's hands, if he used it to raise the price, he could only be confident that he could heavily injure the Ming family in the second 4 bound lots. If the Ming family really went all out in the 3rd round and let go of these 4 bound lots, if Xia Qifei raised the price too high, there could only be 2 possible outcomes. One was that he would not be able to take out 40% of the deposit, and the other was that after successfully winning the first 4 bound lots, he would have no more strength left and watch as the Ming family effortlessly won the next 4 bound lots. The second outcome was not what Fan Xian wanted. He had no way of controlling the shipping routes to Dongyi, so the 4 bound lots that the Ming family could not do without were of little value to him. He did not want Xia Qifei to actually win this lot, but if he watched as the Ming family so easily won the next 4 bound lots, Fan Xian would not be able to swallow it. As for the first possibility, if the price really exploded, under the watchful eyes of Eunuch Huang and Guozheng, under the watchful eyes of so many people, the matter of the palace treasury would truly be for naught, and Xia Qifei would most likely not have a path of survival. In summary, in Fan Xian's earlier plan, the first 4 consecutive bids were to have the Chuanzhou Sun family come out and fire. Xia Qifei's bid was only a feint. He did not plan on risking his life. Looking at the list of bids handed over by the flower hall, Fan Xian knew that the old master of the Ming family had long guessed his plans, so the first round of bids had reached such a terrifying number. The Sun family dared to make a move today because of the message he had sent through Shi Chanli last night. Faced with the Ming family's mountain-like attack, and then thinking of the Ming family brazenly sending people to assassinate Xia Qifei last night, the flames of civil and military fighting each other. Fan Xian began to worry that the Sun family might be scared by this round of bids and not dare to raise the price. The development of the situation was indeed sliding toward a situation Fan Xian did not want to see. When the announcing official yelled out the Ming family's bid of 3.8 million liang of silver, the entire courtyard burst into an uproar. From then on, the door to room B1 never opened again. The Sun family was indeed scared. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the father and son of the Ming family in room A1. He began to think about whether or not the father and son were truly as the Overwatch Council had found and did not participate much in last night's assassination. The person in charge was purely the old matriarch. Assassinating Xia Qifei seemed rash, but when paired with the ferocious bidding today, it could scare off a number of enemies for the Ming family who wanted to take advantage of the chaos. If Ming Qingga was truly someone who could borrow power and even use his own mother, Fan Xian felt that he needed to re-examine him. After the first round of bids came out, Eunuch Huang and Guozheng stroked their beards and smiled. However, Eunuch Huang did not have a beard on his chin, so he appeared comical. At least it could be seen that the two of them were satisfied with the Ming family's move and everyone's reaction. Room B4 was quiet. Through the window lattice, Xia Qifei glanced at Fan Xian with an inquiring gaze. Fan Xian sighed somewhat helplessly and used the palms of his hands to smooth the flying hair at his temples. The meaning of this secret signal was for Xia Qifei to slowly plan. Since the Sun family had backed out, Xia Qifei had to continue bidding. However, he had to control his bidding well. He had to make the Ming family feel pain, but he couldn't be too ruthless. He also had to make the other party take over the first 4 consecutive bids with satisfaction and not suddenly give up and throw these 4 consecutive bids to him. This was a difficult situation. Even if Xia Qifei had the help of a few old officials of the Ministry of Revenue behind him, it was still difficult to deal with it flawlessly. The announcing official once again stood on the stone steps. This happened twice. The anticipated great family battle between the eldest and 7th brother of the Ming family did not happen. The bandits in room B4 completely lost the ferocity of yesterday and carefully bid. Although they were cautious, the price of the first 4 consecutive bids was still slowly raised to a jaw-dropping level. This was, of course, because the Ming family's first round bid was 20% higher than last year's. Another reason was that room B4 was like a sticky candy clinging to the other party. In the end, the successful bidder was still the Ming family. This result was the same as it had been for many years. However, the price they bid was very different from previous years. 12 million liang. Everyone's mouths were wide open as they listened to this price. They thought to themselves that if the palace treasury bidding rule was 5 rounds, Xia Qifei in room B4 and Ming Qingga in room A1 would probably raise this price to twice last year's price. This price was indeed ridiculously high. Fan Xian knew that this could only mean that in previous years, under the eldest princess control, the price of marketing rights had been ridiculously low. At this price, the Ming family would not lose out. Perhaps they would even make a large profit. Of course, this was only if the Ming family still dared to do the pirate business and still dared to smuggle goods into Dongyi under Fan Xian's eyes. Thus, Fan Xian smiled and was very satisfied with this result. The Ming family was just waiting to throw money into this bid this year. Room A1, Ming family, 12 million liang, win. The Palace Treasury Transport Company announcer, who had been listless the entire time, announced the largest bid in the dozen years the palace treasury had been open for bidding. He finally became spirited. The voice of the bid was powerful and powerful. The word "win" left his mouth and disappeared without delay. It appeared very straightforward. No matter what attitude the merchants had toward the Ming family, they all felt a glimmer of excitement and cheered for this number. On the contrary, the father and son of the Ming family in room A1 did not have any joy on their faces, particularly Ming Qingda, who had a faint worry between his brows. What he was thinking was the same as what Fan Xian was thinking. If they didn't have some shady methods to help them, this 4 consecutive bids would definitely be lost. Most importantly, Xia Qifei seemed to have the help of an expert when he called out his bid, and he had a good grasp of the situation. This bid was 5,120,000 taels of silver, and just the deposit alone would cost him more than 2 million taels of silver. Moreover, the other party's real bid would definitely be at the end. Last night, Ming Garden had gathered silver overnight. In total, the 6 branches had only gathered 600,000 liang. It was far from the 1.35 million liang the old Ming matriarch had set. Furthermore, this 4 consecutive bids had already exceeded Ming Qingda's mental budget by too much. What should they do next? There was still half of Taiping Money House's silver tribute left, but no one knew what would happen next. Ming Qingda's hands gently pressed on the wooden box beside him, deep in thought. Ming Launcher glanced at his tired father and felt his heart ache. He knew that his father had not slept at all last night. He had gone through the night to a few large money houses in Suzhou to transfer silver. It was not until the early hours of the morning that he finally received the amount he could be at ease with. Inside this box was the banknote that Zhaoshang Money House had hastily opened. Do you think the imperial envoy still wants the 4 consecutive bids? Ming Qingda sighed tiredly. Ming Launcher didn't know what to say. The sun had moved, and the palace treasury bidding temporarily came to an end. The bailiffs of the Suzhou government and the transport company brought in food for the various officials and merchants to eat. Although the food provided by the government was not as good as the food in the homes of these wealthy people, these merchants still ate with relish. They gathered around the dispirited Xuanzhou Sun family and asked about something. Everyone was looking forward to the afternoon. That was the final battle. In the morning, the terrifying amount of 5 million liang of silver had already been opened. How dazzling would the afternoon be? No one noticed that Ming Qingda silently walked into the main hall and came to the side hall where the major figures were eating. He did not avoid arousing suspicion and smiled slightly. Greetings, Eunuch Huang, Imperial Censor Gua. I have some things I want to report to the Imperial Envoy. I hope the 2 of you will make things easier for me. Eunuch Huang and Guozheng were startled, thinking, what game is this? Does the Ming family want to lean toward Fan Xian in front of their faces? But, it was impossible for him to be so open and aboveboard. Ming Qingda had controlled the Ming family for a long time and had many dealings with the officials in court. He had a sense of authority. Eunuch Huang and Guozheng met each other's eyes and deeply trusted him. They smiled and retreated, leaving him and Fan Xian space to talk. There was no one in the hall. Ming Qingda lifted the front of his robe with some difficulty and knelt in front of Fan Xian. He did not speak. Fan Xian held a bowl in one hand and chopsticks in the other. He was searching between the dishes for something delicious to eat. His gaze did not even glance in that direction. He only said, the 4 consecutive bids at the back, I will still fight for them. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. You're tuning into the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.